John Cottingham, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here.
Who was René Descartes?
Well, Descartes is often described as an early modern philosopher. He wrote in the 17th century, and he was born in France in what's now called Descartes, which is somewhat odd. You say Descartes was born in Descartes, but in the Touraine district. He went to school at La Flèche at the Jesuit college, which he later described as one of the best in Europe. But most of his life, he was in Holland, where he wrote his great masterpieces. The best-known works are the Discourse on the Method, written in French, published anonymously in 1637, and then his masterpiece, the Meditations. The Meditations on First Philosophy, that's to say metaphysics, which were published in Latin in 1641. But as well as being a philosopher in the modern technical sense to do with theory of knowledge, metaphysics, and so on, he was also what we now call a scientist. He was a great mathematician, and he published a massive compendium of his scientific views, which was called the Principia Philosophiae, written in Latin in 4 parts in 1644. Towards the end of his life, he died quite young, he wrote another very important work, I think, The Passions of the Soul, which is about the human being and the emotions and the feelings. So I think his important. Well, what attracted me to him was that his philosophy spans so many areas. It's in my own work, I've argued for a synoptic conception of philosophy that instead of just focusing on narrow issues, takes in a broad range and sees how different parts of our worldview connect together or clash. And with Descartes, you've got metaphysics, you've got physics. He was interested in medicine and physiology, and in ethics, the good questions about the good life. And as I mentioned, about the passions of the soul, that's to say the psychology of the human being and the emotions. So we get an entire system, but he's also, you asked why he's important. He's also a pivotal figure, I think, because he both looks back to the Middle Ages, and he was very influenced by the Christian scholastic philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, which he knew very well. He doesn't acknowledge it in his writings, but in all sorts of places you can see the influence of that great medieval tradition, which is now, we know, as scholasticism, kind of fusion of the Bible and Aristotle, really.
Yeah, right.
He defined himself in a way in opposition to the Aristotelian approach, and claimed to be offering a new philosophical system. So that's important too, because he envisaged a new kind of science based on mathematics, quantities essentially, rather than the forms and qualities of the old Aristotelian school of philosophy.
Yeah, well, he's often described as like the founding father of like Western philosophy. Do you think that's accurate? Where does that come from?
I think, it's often said that he made questions of knowledge the first questions in philosophy. There's some truth in that. And as I'm sure we'll be talking about, his famous Cogito ergo sum, I'm thinking, therefore I exist, arises out of a process of seeing what can be doubted.
Yeah.
He pushes doubt to its limits, arrives at an indubitable awareness of his own existence. So the questions about knowledge are the ones he starts with. But he very quickly moves on to questions which are still, I think, of interest. Questions about God, the existence of God, the foundations of knowledge, whether the existence of God somehow secures reliable knowledge, and perhaps most famously nowadays, the mind-body question,
Right.
the nature of the mind and its relation to the body.
Yeah. So Descartes' a little bit all over the place. Like you say, he's probably most famous today, remembered for this famous quote, this cogito ergo sum, or as it first shows up, je pense donc je suis. I think, therefore I am.
Yeah.
Having said that, you've just translated it as I am thinking, therefore I exist, rather than I think, therefore I am. There's maybe something to unpack there, but maybe we can start with sort of how we get there, because this is, as you say, like the foundation, the basis of the worldview which he goes on to build up in the Meditations. And the Meditations begin with a kind of skepticism. Descartes realizes that there are so many things he believes about the world. He believes in the existence of the external world, this microphone in front of me, but realizes that maybe that doesn't exist. You know, maybe I'm wrong about this, maybe I'm wrong about that. And so he decides to start taking everything that it's possible to doubt, that we could think, well, I don't know if that's true, and let's treat it as though it's false, and see what we're left with. So Descartes is often associated with this tradition of skepticism. Skeptics are people who think, oh, we can't know anything, we don't know if the world exists. And because of this process, Descartes is often called a skeptic. But that's probably not an accurate description of what Descartes' doing.
I agree with you. I think that's quite inaccurate and wrong. He uses doubt, but as a means to an end.
Yep.
So the employment of doubt, which comes in three waves, really, leaves us with asking the question, does anything survive these three waves of doubt? So it's only a process with a definite goal in mind. The three waves, just briefly, are first, the senses. Most of our knowledge comes by the senses, but the senses, he says, are unreliable. Why? Well, he doesn't give many instances in the Meditations, but there's some stock arguments he discussed with correspondents. For example, a stick in water may look bent, but really it's straight when you lift it out. So the senses give us confusing, contradictory information, or they may seem to. That's a worry that goes right back to Plato, so it wasn't original to Descartes. The second wave of doubt is the so-called dreaming argument. And here we are sitting in London talking, but particularly if, like Descartes, you're a vivid dreamer, particularly if you're a lucid dreamer, that's to say someone who even in the dreams wonders, oh, this is weird, perhaps it's a dream. And some people don't know what that is talking about, but many people have had that experience. For such people, it's eminently plausible that I might now wake up and I'm not in London at all, I'm back home in bed. And that's exactly the doubt that Descartes raises. So I can't even be sure that I'm now sitting in this chair talking to you. But then he broadens it out and suggests that even chairs, tables, may be dreamlike illusions. As he says in the first meditation, the earth, the sky, and all external things may be the illusions of dreams. So there he's raising the question about whether I can be sure there really is a world, a planet Earth, objects around me. And then finally he introduces this scenario of the malicious demon.
Yes.
Who's employing all his energies to trick him with any illusions possible. So the whole shebang, the whole thing might be. But if he is being deceived, he must exist. St. Augustine, many centuries earlier, had said, si fallor sum, if I am being deceived, I must exist. And in a way, Descartes trades on that. Even if this demon is deceiving, there must be a me to be being deceived. And to pick up the point you raised, what he comes out with is, I think, I am thinking, therefore I exist. In other words, it's not I think, it's not a sort of general claim about me that from time to time I think. It's rather at this moment I'm thinking. even if I'm doubting, I must be thinking, because doubting is itself a thought process.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as I'm thinking, I must exist. There's nothing necessary about my thinking. I could stop any moment. I
Yeah.
could cease to exist any moment. So there's nothing necessary about my existence. But so long as this is a very limited flickering candle of certainty. So long as I'm actually engaged now in this process of thinking, for that period I must be existing. And not even the most all-powerful demon or God or malicious God could make me not exist. Of course, he could stop me existing,
Mm-hmm.
but he couldn't make me not exist so long as I'm thinking. Does that
Yeah,
make
because
sense?
you could stop existing, but then you wouldn't be thinking. And so Descartes is suddenly struck with, as you say, these waves of doubt. It's like, well, how can I know any of these things? So, well, I can't know this, I can't know that. What can I know with certainty? Well, I can know that this chair exists. Well, maybe not, because maybe there's this malicious demon who is like affecting my senses. And a modern rethinking of this is the simulation idea. Some people think that we're living in a simulation as a matter of fact, but just as a skeptical tool, you could say, well, can you prove that this isn't all a computer simulation and that somebody is fooling us into prodding our brains, or we're a brain in a vat somewhere and it's all simulated? It's like, I'm not saying that's true. We're not saying we think we live in a simulation. We're just saying, how can we know that we're not? Because what we want is knowledge and certainty. And Descartes says, well, we can't know that. So what can I know with certainty? Well, if I doubt everything I can, doubting is a form of thinking. And as long as I'm thinking, there is a thinking being that's doing some thinking, which is me. And so this shows up first in the discourse and in the method, right? As je pense donc je suis, I think, therefore I am, is how it's usually translated. But as you just indicated, a problem with this idea is that it kind of sounds like an argument. It sounds like somebody saying, premise one, I think, therefore, conclusion, I exist. But it's probably best not thought of in those terms?
Right. I think Descartes wasn't entirely consistent when he was asked about this.
Yeah.
In the second meditation, the formula is sum existo. I am, I exist, is certain, as often as it's put forward by me or conceived in the mind. Quoties profertur vel mente concipitur. So there's no I think therefore there. He's just saying straight out, I am, I exist is certain. But then the thinking comes in, well, as long as it's put forward or conceived in the mind.
And to be clear, he doesn't say there, I exist so long as I'm thinking. He says, I am certain that I exist so long as I'm thinking. It's the certainty that thinking guarantees.
That's true. And indeed indubitable certainty, because even doubting it would confirm it.
Yeah.
There are not many propositions such that doubting them entails their truth.
Yeah, right.
As far as the point you raised, very interesting point about whether it's a sort of argument, he was once asked about the status of the cogito, if you like to put it that way.
And the cogito is this phrase...
Meaning, I'm thinking, therefore I exist.
From the Latin version, cogito ergo sum.
Cogito ergo sum, I'm thinking. And of course, cogito, you can translate the present tense in Latin or in French, je pense, in two ways, either I think or I am thinking. English has that luxury. And I think for the reasons I've just been saying, I think we should go for the second, I am thinking. But he was asked about, is this really the first proposition you can know? Does it sort of come out of nothing? And he says, when I said it's the first proposition, I didn't mean to imply that you don't, in order to do it, as it were, need to know other things. You need to know, he said, what thought is, what existence is, and that in order to think, one must exist.
Right.
Pour penser, il faut être, in French. So that leaves it slightly unclear, actually, as to whether it's just a kind of performance, something we sort of do, and as long as we do it, we know we're certainly, we have certainty that it's true, or whether there's some kind of implied inference.
Well, of course, you could say, as we just have, we could say, well, look, as long as I'm thinking, I must exist. And even if I doubt, doubting is a kind of thinking. And so this is our foundational bit of knowledge. And somebody could come along and say, oh, but how do you know that, if you're doubting, then you're thinking? Well, because it's a kind of thinking. It's eminently logical. They go, what's this logic thing that you're talking about? Is that a more foundational thing? As if to say that you do actually have to have some assumptions. You need to believe in the law of non-contradiction, the laws of logic, all of this kind of stuff, before you can get to the cogito.
I think that's right. It sometimes seems as if he's starting completely from scratch. And that actually is the metaphor he uses. He talks about destroying everything, erasing everything, and starting right from the foundations. But actually, even in order to start meditating at all, to start thinking, you've got to have access to concepts, to meaning. And this has given rise to a modern criticism of Descartes, namely that language, you've got to have language to start thinking, and that already implies a public world. This was made famous by Wittgenstein, Ludwig Wittgenstein, the famous 20th century philosopher, who pointed out that language has to have public rules. You can't have a
private language, as he says.
Precisely, the so-called private language argument. So Descartes, even in sitting in his lonely room by the fire, his stove-heated room, sitting in his winter dressing gown, this is the scenario he describes in the first meditation, even then he must be drawing on a whole public domain of concepts, of language, of rules of language. And therefore, there's something a bit suspect about the idea of a private starting point to knowledge.
Yes, which would mean that this cogito couldn't serve as the actual foundation of knowledge, because you need to know certain things in order to get there. Is that something that Descartes, either in the Meditations or in his correspondence afterwards, recognizes and addresses in his time?
I think he's attracted to the idea of this first person starting point. So although he acknowledged that in order to do it, you've got to know what thought means, what existence means, and that in order to think one must exist. Nonetheless, there's something, and I think this remains true for many people today, there's something appealing about the idea that I just start with my own reflection. In a way, philosophy starts this way. Here I am thinking, I can push doubt to the limits, but then what will follow from that? My own subjectivity, my own subjective awareness of my own existence seems to have some kind of special status. It may not be logically justifiable, but I think it has an appeal. But of course, I should add that although he starts with just the I, he very quickly moves out because he immediately becomes aware that among his thoughts, he has this thought of or idea of God, which he reasons that he couldn't have constructed from his own resources.
Yeah, well, this is where the sort of next step comes in, because of course, Descartes, remember, the project is, we want to see if we can justify our knowledge. So let's doubt everything we can. And as we said, Descartes isn't a skeptic. He's not inviting you to say you can't know anything. He's saying, look, well, we want to say that we can know this chair exists. So how can we justify that? How can we get there? So he strips it down to the basis. And he says, okay, I think, therefore I am, or I'm thinking, therefore I exist. So I know that I exist. And the criticism is sort of like, what now?
Yes.
You know you exist, but you don't know in what form. You don't know if you have a body. You don't know if the external world exists. And I think a lot of people either forget or don't realize that the very same logic that Descartes has just used to establish possibly the most famous phrase in the history of philosophy, he then immediately uses the same logic to establish the existence of God.
Yes.
How does he do that?
Yes, it's crucial for him. Although, and before I come on to that, just to pick up what you were saying about not being a skeptic.
Yeah.
His target is science. He's got this new system of mathematically based physics, which he wants to introduce to the world. So he's heading for knowledge all the way. He's not wanting to subvert that. On the contrary, he's wanting to set it up. But uniquely, he sets it up via God.
Mhm.
This is what makes his philosophy very unusual in a way. Because I think normally we'd think, well, science starts with observation, maybe with some mathematical reasoning, maybe with some theories which we test. But the idea that you go via metaphysics, via God, is by modern standards pretty odd.
Mm. Oh, and
But-
also importantly, we should say that Descartes is an example of what's known as a school of philosophy called rationalism. And typically in the history of Western philosophy, we distinguish between the empiricists and the rationalists. And empiricists, people like David Hume, think that knowledge comes from our observations. So we see things in the world, and that's where knowledge comes from. For the rationalists, like Descartes, knowledge comes from within ourselves. So whereas an empiricist might look at the world and say, well, look at this chair, look at that tree, from which we might say, do we think God exists? Descartes, being a rationalist, starts internally. And so one of the interesting sort of facets of that is that rather than looking at the world to prove God, he looks to God to prove the world.
That's very well put, if I may say so. And he follows here again St. Augustine, who talked about in the interior human there dwells the truth. We go inside. And Descartes goes inside to his own thoughts and finds certain innate ideas that he thinks did not come from outside. One of them is the idea of the self, the idea of thought. But most importantly, this idea of a being of infinite perfection. So how does he get to there? Well, as I'm thinking, I exist. What am I is the next question. What is this thinking thing? Well, I know at once that I'm imperfect, that there are many things I don't know, many things I can't do. So knowledge of one's own existence carries for Descartes an immediate sense of how we fall short. I think there's something profound here about our human self-awareness. We have great aspirations, but we're aware of ourselves as lacking. We can't do everything we would like. We can't know everything we would like. But, reasons Descartes, I also, looking within, again, as you were saying, looking inside me, I have a sense of something that doesn't fall short, something that's free from imperfections. In fact, he reasons from the very fact of seeing myself as imperfect, that implicitly suggests that I have an idea of something that's perfect. From my very failings, I can dimly at least reach the idea of a being without such failing.
Imperfection is defined in terms of perfection. It's the negation of perfection.
Yes.
As C.S. Lewis put it in a slightly different context later on, a man cannot call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line.
Precisely. And Descartes actually says that the idea of perfection is prior to the idea of imperfection. That still perhaps doesn't get us to God, it just gets us to an idea. But Descartes goes on to suggest this idea is actually beyond me. I could not have created it because the content of the idea, and here I think is influenced by his mathematical studies.
Right.
The idea of infinity is something I actually can't grasp, but I can, as it were, reach towards it.
Yeah, Descartes has this helpful distinction between understanding and imagining, right? Like in that you might think to yourself, well, I don't have this idea of the infinite inside me because I can't imagine infinity. And Descartes says, okay, well, can you understand a 112-sided shape? Yeah, I can understand what that is. I can do maths with it. I can tell you facts about a 112-sided shape. But can I imagine it? Can I grasp what it would look like? It kind of no, it's too many sides. I can't. And so even though I can't imagine it, Descartes says, I can still understand the concept and what it means. And infinity for him is a bit like this, or the perfection is a bit like this.
You're right. There's certainly a distinction in imagining and understanding in Descartes. So I can't imagine a 1,000-sided figure.
Yeah.
But I can understand what's meant by it, and I can, as you were saying, prove properties of it. With the infinite, it's actually even more than that, because I can't even understand it fully. I can't comprehend it.
Mhm.
Descartes said in a letter to his editor, actually, Marat Mersenne, God is like the mountain, which I can't comprehend. I can't put my arms round it, but I can perhaps reach towards it in my thought.
Mhm.
And the infinite is like that. I can never reach it. If you give me a number, I can always add one and say, well, it's not that.
Yeah.
I can, as it were, reach towards it. But I already am aware of something that exceeds my grasp.
Mhm.
And that's, again, part of the tradition he inherited from Augustine and Aquinas.
Mhm.
Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century says that God cannot be fully comprehended by the finite human mind. Augustine, even earlier, at the close of the Roman Empire, says, si comprehendis non est Deus. If you comprehend him, he's not God.
Mhm.
If you think you've comprehended, it's not God, it's some idol of your own
Yes.
creation. So, in a way, this argument, although Descartes presented it as a logical argument in the third meditation we're now talking about, it's more, I think, like an encounter. This is the view taken by the great French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas in the 20th century. It's a kind of encounter of the finite, limited mind with something infinitely beyond it, which can't be fully grasped,
Mhm.
but which we already know we fall short of.
Now, interestingly for Descartes, because there might be some confusion here in thinking like, well, if we've stripped away everything, and we're in the process of doubting, well, I know that I exist, but, not everybody has this idea of infinity. Not every, a newborn baby doesn't know what infinity means and hasn't thought about God. So, is this a problem for Descartes? Because Descartes needs to, in order to establish God's existence, he needs to say that I find within myself this idea, but if we're trying to strip everything away, not everybody has that idea, right?
That's true. Not everyone has it, if you like, as an occurrent idea, actually active in the mind. But Descartes maintained that nonetheless, it's there in the treasure house of the mind. He used that metaphor. You referred to his rationalism earlier, and the rationalists tend to believe in innate ideas, that the mind has this stock of innate ideas. Are they present when the baby is still in the womb? Pretty clearly not actually present. We're not born meditating on metaphysics or on mathematics. But Descartes says nonetheless, the idea is still there, waiting, as it were, to be thought about.
Be drawn out, as is the etymological root of education.
Yes.
Means to draw out.
Yes.
And it's not difficult to imagine. I mean, obviously, a baby doesn't know how to do calculus, but it's not difficult to imagine that all of the mental machinery needed to do calculus is there in that brain. It just needs the input data to sort of draw it out, to unlock it.
Yeah, I mean, this again is quite an ancient idea in philosophy. In Plato, there's a dialogue called the Meno, where Meno interrogates a slave boy who doesn't know any geometry, but he manages to get him by careful step-by-step reasoning to see how to construct a square which is double the area of a given square. And he didn't, as it were, he didn't put the knowledge in.
He drew it out.
By working on the innate. So I think Descartes would say, no, we don't necessarily. We could go through life never thinking about these questions about God, but should someone draw rather like a triangle. You may never have thought of an isosceles triangle, but once I draw your attention to it, I could get you to see certain properties about the angles and so on.
Well, I think this is important to realize, is that as we move on through this, we're about to sort of talk about this argument whereby Descartes reasons from this idea of God that we have, this idea of perfection, let's say, an unlimited being. We can prove that he exists, and we'll talk about why. But some people might say, but what if I don't have this idea? And I think the point is that, well, maybe you don't have that idea. And if you don't have that idea, then maybe you can't be certain that God exists. But Descartes had that idea. And as long as he has that idea, he's thinking, what can I be certain of?
Yes.
Well, if I have this idea and I know it can't have come from me, then I know that God must exist. Just like a triangle. If somehow the existence of triangles proved God, then if you thought of a triangle, you'd prove God.
Yes.
Doesn't mean you have to think of a triangle. It just means that if you do, we can do this reasoning.
Precisely.
Okay.
I think that's absolutely right. And that brings out, I think, an important point about Descartes' procedure. It's not like a sort of blackboard set of philosophical arguments in a classroom.
Mm-hmm.
It's a process you have to go through.
Yes.
And in the preface to the Meditations, Descartes says, I'm not interested in people who aren't prepared to go along with me and do the meditating.
Yes.
Something you have to actually do. And as you follow, and you have to, as it were, do it for yourself. Each individual has to follow this path, the path of meditation, as the title implies. And in doing that, you will come to see certain truths.
Yeah, I mean, it seems very sort of brainy, like philosophy. He's sat there in his robe and he's just thinking, and it's sort of an intellectual enterprise, the kind of thing you could write down on the blackboard. But Descartes valued experience. I mean, for him, the meditation was a, as you say, a sort of journey that he went through. But also, I mean, you've written in sort of semi-biography of him that, like, when he joined the army, it seemed from some of his writings that one of the things he most enjoyed was that he got to travel, and he just was seeking experience of the world, and at least in his earlier life seemed to value travel and lived experience over sitting down and just reading books. So it seems like within Descartes there is this value of actually experiencing, going on a journey, thinking,
yes,
living out the thought rather than just, as you say, writing it on a blackboard.
Yeah, no, I think that's quite true. And although he goes on this a sort of military adventure, really, in the course of those travels, he ends up in this stove-heated room in Bavaria in southern Germany, and that's where we think this first idea occurred to him of founding a whole new system of philosophy, a marvelous new system, which would be based on the innate ideas, what he called the clear and distinct ideas of mathematics. But
so put us out of our misery here. Where's this God coming from? So we've got as far as saying that Descartes has thought to himself, okay, I exist, and I'm aware that I have this conception of perfection, even if just because I realize I'm imperfect. And I don't mean morally or something like that. I just mean that there are things I don't know. There are things I can't do, which implies that I'm limited. But this idea of limitation and imperfection only makes sense in the context of knowing what perfection means. So we have this idea of perfection, and this perfection of the infinite. We sort of know what that means, even if we can't quite grasp it. Okay, so someone listening, so what's that got to do with God?
Well, God, of course, is traditionally defined in terms of perfections, omnipotence, omniscience, and indeed benevolence. So God is, as Descartes was later to put it in the fifth meditation, the sum of all perfections. And if he's the sum of all perfections, supreme perfection, then he must, Descartes reasons, exist. This is a slightly different argument, the so-called ontological argument. But I think, and that raises questions of its own. But I think from the standpoint of the earlier meditation, the third meditation, the point is that I couldn't have constructed this idea from my own resources. Therefore, it must correspond to something real.
Now the question is, why couldn't he have come up with the idea of infinity for himself? Why isn't that something that could just be the invention of Descartes' own mind?
I think it hinges, this is the crucial question, which will distinguish those who can accept the argument from those who just don't find it convincing. And as often in philosophy, I think there's no definitive way to establish which position is right. But from Descartes' point of view, he's encountered this notion of infinity, which is beyond him. He's encountered something beyond, in a certain way, beyond his grasp. and therefore it must be real because it can't have come from inside.
Yeah. So this is something which, in the modern era, looking back at Descartes, we try to sort of put into argumentative form, and it's broadly known as the trademark argument, right? And this so-called trademark argument, called the trademark because there's this thing inside of Descartes, which is perfection, which seems to have the trademark of God. It's got this sort of nature about it which shows that it's from somewhere else. It's got this trademark of God within him. And it relies on something which also has come to be called the causal adequacy principle. Can you tell us what that is?
Yes. Well, the trademark, just starting with that, he recognizes the idea of God like the mark of the craftsman stamped on his work.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit like the Alfred Hitchcock movies. This is one of the, Alfred Hitchcock always put himself in his movie.
Yes.
He's the man at the bus stop or the man in the lounge of the hotel reading a newspaper.
That's his trademark.
Exactly. It shows the origin of the film. It's an authentic Hitchcock film. So similarly, the thought is that God planted this idea of infinite perfection in the mind of the meditator to be, as it were, the trademark, the mark of the craftsman stamped on the work. Now, I don't know if you want me to go into the details of the formal presentation of the argument, but the idea is that there's very crudely, there's nothing in the effect which was not present in the cause.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have an effect, then the cause must be somehow adequate to producing that effect.
So, for example, if something causes something else to be hot, that cause also has to be hot. A cold thing can't cause something to be hot.
Exactly.
And there are probably all kinds of examples we can think of, but in order for an effect to get something from a cause, the cause must have that thing.
Precisely. And Descartes uses himself the idea of heat. So your cup of coffee there has a certain amount of heat. It can't have got it from nowhere, so it must have got it from a kettle or an urn or a stove, which was at least as hot as the heat in the coffee in that cup. It's got to be as hot or more hot, roughly.
Yeah.
Now, that applies to physical things and seems plausible. But Descartes is going to go on to say it also applies to the content of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something very tricky, which is highly controversial. But the thought is, it's not just going to apply to physical objects, it's going to apply. Here's an analogy. Supposing you find a 5-year-old child who's drawn a very intricate diagram of a computer circuit or something of that nature. You can reason, well, with the mental age of 5, he or she just couldn't have produced that. So it must have got it from somewhere else. So, perhaps from a diagram in a book. Where did that come from? The content, the richness, the intricacy must have come from somewhere. Answer from the author, from someone who had in his mind at least as much intricacy as you see in the diagram or in the chart. So rather neatly, Descartes saying, the idea being analogous to the diagram or the drawing.
Yep.
The content of the drawing has still, even though it's just a drawing, not a real thing, it's got to have a cause. So similarly, even though your idea of perfection is just an idea in your mind, something has got to have put it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so because the child just draws a picture of the computer. Computer doesn't exist. It's literally just a cartoon. But even though it's only a representation of a thing, it still has to have a cause which really has the complexity that's represented in that idea.
Precisely.
And just as we look at the child and think, okay, you're a child, you don't know what a computer is, that must have come from somewhere else. Descartes looks at us and goes, you're just a limited human. You've got this idea of perfection, that must have come from somewhere else.
Precisely.
You can say, well, that's just an idea of perfection. Well, it's just a drawing of a computer. It must have come from real complexity. And this idea of perfection must have come from real perfection too. So this is what, as I say, has been called the causal adequacy principle, that the cause must have like an adequate amount of the relevant stuff to bring about the effect.
Yes. And that's going to apply not just to physical properties, but to the representative properties.
Yes.
The properties represented in a drawing or a diagram, or in this case, in an idea.
Yeah.
So by your very fact that you're able to represent to yourself in some form, albeit in a rudimentary form, because we can never fully represent the infinite. But the very fact that we have some grasp of that notion shows that there must be, we can reason that there must be a cause which is adequate to the complexity of that idea.
And if the complexity of the idea is perfection, then it must come from something perfect. And like you say, it's important to note with a lot of these kinds of arguments that I think one response people come up with is often to say, okay, but why does that have to be God? And I think it's important to point out that someone like Descartes could say, okay, forget the word God. Let's not talk about God. Let's just now admit that we've established the existence of a perfect being. If you don't want to call that God, you don't have to. But what we're establishing here is that there must exist this perfect being. Okay, now, we want to sort of do an overview of Descartes here, but I think people will be screaming at the screens and they'll want to know, like, okay, that sounds kind of sensible, but there are a few problems that jump out. And I suppose let me give you two, just because this is the third meditation. Like we say, we've got to the point where Descartes has established that he exists. He now thinks that a perfect being exists, and then we're going to move on. But people are going to say, well, okay, two problems. Firstly, this causal adequacy principle. Is it really true that what's in the effect has to be in the cause? For example, what about emergent properties? A cake is spongy, right? And all of the things that made that cake, the flour, the eggs, the hands that move, like the motion, all of that, none of those things are spongy. And yet all of those causes produce this effect of sponginess. So if the causal adequacy principle is correct, there must be sponginess in the cause, but there's no sponginess in the cause.
Right.
Likewise with temperature. We now know temperature is just the excitation of atoms. And yet an atom on its own vibrating is not hot. It's an emergent property. And so it seems like we do have these effects which are not present in their causes.
Yes, you're throwing back at me the sponge cake example, which I think
from your very own book.
And of course, it would be very crude to think that any given property P must be present in that form in the causes of it. But I think we can reason that there must be, if you take, for example, the conservation of the energy principle in physics, there must be at least as much energy in the cause of a given energetic phenomenon as you find in the phenomenon. You kind of got it from nowhere.
And physicists will accept that happily today. Like they might want to quibble with the terminology, because Descartes wouldn't have been thinking in terms of atomic physics, right? But there is a reworked conception of the same argument.
Yes. And I think the thought is that in some form, either literally or in a higher form, whatever you find in the effect will be present in the cause. But as I say, I think although this can be structured as a logical argument, demonstration, and Descartes was always attracted by the clarity of geometry, where you have absolute rigid demonstration. You have axioms, definitions, and then certain theorems follow. And he was asked to present this proof in geometrical form by some of his interlocutors. And he did. But whether it really makes it more convincing, personally, I'm not sure. To my mind, the most convincing way of thinking of it is as a process, as the meditator going through this process of doubt, finding his own imperfection, and then encountering something which exceeds his imperfect mind. And it's that encounter which I think delivers the goods for Descartes, more, although he was adept at producing elaborate formal proofs. But I think it delivers more persuasiveness than just presenting it as a kind of quasi-deductive process.
And that's so often the case with philosophy. I talk all the time about coming to sort of belief in God, for example. There are syllogisms and arguments, but most people in their actual personal life, the way that they come to profound philosophical changes is through profound philosophical realizations, which are not of the kind, oh, wow, gosh, that third premise really does follow from the second one. It's more like an intuition, or something hits you, or the penny drops, as they say. And something about reflecting on this nature of perfection for Descartes, it's like, oh, this comes from outside of me.
The light bulb goes on.
Yeah.
And I think actually there are very few arguments in philosophy, if any, where you can start with self-evident premises that every rational person must agree to, and then step by step force them to conclusions.
Yeah.
If that was true, then all the great problems of philosophy about determinism, free will, God, so could be settled. But it clearly isn't like that. And
well, there's an interesting question as to what Descartes' project is here, because like you said earlier, most people associate him with epistemology, the philosophy of how you know things, right? Because it seems like he's not even necessarily trying to establish what is true, but rather what you can be certain of, or at the very least, what it's impossible to doubt, which might not quite be the same thing.
I think it's true that the two are different, but I think the importance of God for him, and we haven't yet come on to this, is that once he has to his satisfaction established such a God, the perfections of God mean that God is not a deceiver. So the creator God of the Christian, Judeo-Christian tradition cannot be malicious, cannot be. Why not? Because malice, deception is a sign of weakness. Why would you lie to someone? Because you're frightened, or because there's something you want which you can't get. Now, none of that can apply to a supremely perfect being.
Yeah, God is sort of the anti-evil demon.
Precisely.
Where Descartes imagines the evil demon is this epistemic problem, which is if there might be this evil demon who's deceiving me and the table doesn't exist, the epistemic solution is God, who, because he is good, cannot deceive.
Yes.
Importantly, it's not as clear as like, because God exists, I know that the table exists. There's still a few more steps.
No, but at least I can have a hope of achieving the truth. I think truth now does come in.
Yes.
Because, as Descartes put it in an interview to a young Dutchman, Franz Boerman, in 1648, a reliable mind was God's gift to me. So in creating me, this perfect being would not have given me mental equipment that's fundamentally flawed.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean I have a hot line to the truth. Obviously, we all make mistakes in logic, in mathematics, in science all the time. But in principle, when we focus on the clearest and simplest propositions of logic and mathematics, Descartes reasons we can't be wrong. Because, and I think actually that may sound a bit sort of weird and faith rather than philosophical reason. But actually, I think we couldn't be having this conversation now unless we felt that, to some extent at least, our minds are configured in such a way that we can track the truth.
That's an important argument that comes up in other contexts, like the argument from reason and our ability to trust reason.
Yes.
I want to ask a question about that, but just beforehand, I wanted to give our listeners a taste of this, the way you talk about Descartes going on a journey and having sort of an experience. I think this is embodied in the second meditation, where in the first meditation, Descartes realizes all of these doubts. Thinks about the evil demon and all of this kind of stuff. And he opens the second meditation in this state of doubt. And it's so interesting that in a philosophical text, you can read a sentence like this. He says, so serious are the doubts into which I've been thrown as a result of yesterday's meditation, that I can neither put them out of my mind nor see any way of resolving them. It feels as if I've fallen unexpectedly into a deep whirlpool which tumbles me around so that I can neither stand on the bottom nor swim up to the top. And then he says, nevertheless, nevertheless, I will make an effort and once more attempt the same path I sat on yesterday. So he literally describes, in this, again, this is like a foundational philosophical text.
Yes.
It's not premise one, premise two, conclusion. He's saying, I've thought about this, and I feel like I'm at a complete loss. I feel like I'm in a whirlpool. My
Yes.
feet can't find the ground. It's clearly like a deeply experiential thing for Descartes.
I think that's very important. And I think, although, as you know, I'm trained in the analytic tradition, I have great admiration for the methods of, there's a precision and clarity that is so important in Anglophone analytic philosophy. Nonetheless, I think we often ignore that dimension, the dimension of the experiential. And if I can just quote another passage, which is, I think, similar to that. This is at the end of the third meditation, where he says, before examining all this more carefully, I should like to pause for a while and spend some time in the contemplation of God, to reflect on his attributes and gaze with wonder and adoration at the beauty of this immense light. So that is not Descartes, the analytic reasoner, doubting it. That is a kind of submissive contemplation of the immense light of truth and goodness, which he thinks he's discovered. So, yes, we start in the whirlpool, we're absolutely lost, tumbled around. We end up in a moment of calm contemplation. And these are both intensely personal and I think intensely emotional experiences. Those words, in the original text, it's almost like a litany: adore, admire, wonder at.
Yes.
And wonder, of course, is an emotion.
Yeah, I mean, it's crucial and interesting to think that exists at the foundation of this sort of Western philosophical thought tradition. And yet it is still worth remembering that this is a philosophical text that people analyze as making a contribution to knowledge. And one important thing that we just sort of mentioned is this idea that Descartes' establishing of God's existence is in part of his epistemological project to ground knowledge. In fact, Blaise Pascal in the Pensées says, I will never forgive Descartes, because Descartes sort of establishes God's existence to get his epistemology off the ground and then just has no need for him ever again. Just like, all right, thanks, see you later, I'm not sure if that's actually true in Descartes' personal life, but that's what Pascal thought. The question that will spring to mind for people is, okay, let's just grant for a moment that Descartes has established with the light of reason that a perfect God exists. You've already indicated that this somehow gives us hope that God won't be a deceiver, so the evil demon doesn't exist. But as you say, our minds still go wrong every now and again. We do things incorrectly. So how can Descartes use this as a way to justify our apprehension of truth if it's still the case that even though God exists, we still go wrong?
Right. Yes, the problem of error. In theology, there's the problem of evil. If there's a good God, how come all this suffering? In Descartes, we have sort of epistemological analog of that, the problem of error. If God is the source of all truth, this perfect being, how come we go wrong? And Descartes' answer, briefly, is that, of course, we do go wrong, but we can't go wrong in the very simple and clear propositions. So as long as I am thinking I must exist, I couldn't be wrong about that. Similarly, and he ranks this almost equally with the Cogito, 2 + 3 = 5. Now, of course, the malicious demon could muck about with the symbols, but as long as you and I are actually focusing on that proposition, as long as we're there, attending to it, it can't be wrong.
And Descartes has this crucial term of the clear and distinct perceptions, which he uses to delineate these particular kinds of perceptions. And for Descartes, perceptions are like, the things that are in the mind, ideas and
yes,
and stuff like that.
The apprehensions of the intellect. So they're clear insofar as they're present, directly present to the mind. They're distinct insofar as they contain nothing except what is clear. And this is why mathematics, the simple axioms of mathematics, appeal to him. I mean, if I say that table is solid, all sorts of questions about that. What do I mean by solid? Will it be solid under the micro?
But so it's clear in that the idea is in front of you, but it's not distinct because it's not it doesn't consist only in clarity. It's got all of this other fuzzy stuff as well. What do these words mean? Does the external world exist? What is wood? Are atoms mostly empty space? All of this kind of nonsense floating around.
Sure.
Whereas 2 + 3 = 5, there it is, on its own. There it stands.
No, it implies nothing except what is present. And this really leads on to physics for Descartes, because he thinks, rather like Galileo, his near contemporary, that mathematics is the key to science. This was something revolutionary and new in the 17th century, which has proved to be substantially correct. Descartes had these mathematical laws of physics, which were all wrong. Newton, a few decades later, much better ones, but they're both agreed on the mathematical principles, which for Descartes are, in their simplest form, are guaranteed by the benevolence of God.
So here's something really important then, right? So Descartes has established, through the light of pure reason, clearly and distinctly, that God exists. Because the idea of God as a perfect being and therefore a trademark within us is clear and distinct, and therefore I know that God exists. And because God exists, I know that I can trust my clear and distinct perceptions. But if you need to believe in God to trust your clear and distinct perceptions, but Descartes has proved the existence of God as a clear and distinct perception, isn't he arguing in a circle? This is what's known as the Cartesian circle.
Yes, Cartesian from Cartesius, the Latin version of Descartes'
Which is such a cooler version of his name, don't you think? Cartesius. Might start calling him that instead.
Yes, well, in Italian he's called Cartesio. So yeah, whether the circle can ultimately be broken out of, I don't know. But I think insofar as Descartes does it, it's by this idea of immediate focus, as long as I'm actually here and now focusing. So the certainty is very limited, very temporary. And actually, you mentioned Pascal earlier. I think actually that comment is unfair to Descartes, although much of what Pascal says I think is fascinating. But in this point, Descartes doesn't make a distinction between creation and conservation. That's to say, God recreates anew every second, every moment, every split second of time. And without that conserving power of God, things wouldn't exist at all. So I can know I exist as long as I'm thinking, but unless God conserves me from moment to moment, and the same with the whole cosmos, it would not exist. So the God Descartes discovers is very similar to Thomas Aquinas' God.
That's what I was just thinking.
Who is the sustainer as well as the creator.
Yeah, quite. Yeah. Okay. So this problem of the Cartesian circle, to be clear, we talked about 2 and 3 = 5, but if I'm not mistaken, when Descartes is considering all the things he can doubt, he starts, with the external world, and then he thinks about maths. And as far as I'm aware, he does think to himself, the evil demon could even make me go wrong every time I add 2 and 3. This evil demon that exists, even with something as obvious to me as 2 and 3 = 5, it's possible that every time I do that calculation, the evil demon just prods my brain and makes me go wrong every single time. And so weirdly, before we've established the existence of God, Descartes thinks he can't even trust those most clear and distinct perceptions, but he then establishes God's existence through a clear and distinct perception. So is this a functional criticism of Descartes? Is it something he addresses?
He does, I think. And the answer he offers, I think, depends really on, if you like, the difference between a first order and a second order doubt. The doubts you've just raised are, maybe I could go wrong about my simplest mathematical intuitions. But then the first order question is, what I'm now focusing on when I say 2 + 3 = 5, could I be wrong about that? And Descartes' answer is no. As he puts it in the third meditation, when I've raised the doubt of the demon, but when I turn to the truths themselves, which I think I perceive so clearly, I'm so convinced that I declare, I'm quoting from memory, let him who will deceive me, he can never make it that I'm nothing as long as I think I'm something, or that 2 and 3 are more or less than 5.
Which, by the way, out of context, is a wonderfully motivational quote, isn't it? Like, let any demon try as hard as he can. He will never convince me that I am nothing.
Right.
I remember underlining that when I first came across it and thinking that would look good on a poster. But okay, so, and really important here is like the immediacy, right? Descartes is not saying, like, okay, with these, at least in this first stage, here are these mathematical truths, and here's, my thinking, and here's like, God's perfection. And so, all right, that's all settled. Put that on the shelf. I've proved that God exists. And for the rest of my life, I can say, oh, I know that God exists. And if someone asks me why, I go, oh, well, because of, there's this proof. It's only when you've got it in your mind that you can have the certainty, only in that moment. And what Descartes wants to do is transition from the certainty he can hold in the moment of clearly and distinctly perceiving God's existence. Right there and then, I know that God exists. But now, 5 seconds later, I remember that I thought God exists, but I can't be certain of it until it's actually in the brain. But Descartes wants to move from that immediacy to a more broad epistemology.
Exactly.
And he does that through, the knowledge of God is immediate, which establishes the trustworthiness of my clear and distinct perceptions. And so then I can take God out of my mind and now trust my clear and distinct perceptions.
It's as if this tiny flicker of this candle of certainty, my own existence, and then I can reach to God's existence. And then the candle is, as it were, lit the bonfire, and now the whole room is illuminated.
Quite. And you need that candle to light the building, and the candle needs to be there and then, like, while you're holding it. But once you've lit the room, then the candle can go out.
And if we sort of relate this to our modern ideas, I think we do have an idea of the world as it really is, the truth as it really is. Bernard Williams described this as the absolute conception, the conception of the cosmos as it would be agreed on by any rational inhabitant of the galaxy or the cosmos, something objectively and absolutely true. The question he raised is, because he strongly criticized Descartes' proofs, whether we can get there without God, whether without this metaphysical bridge we can reach absolute conception of truth. And it's doubtful. It's doubtful that we can. In other words, if we delete the whole idea of the reliability of the mind, the God-given reliability of the human mind in its most basic logical and mathematical intuitions, then do we have any principled hope that we are creatures who might be able to reach the truth? So the whole enterprise of philosophy and of science is then not exactly thrown into doubt, but there are worries there about why we should think that this randomly evolved creature, Homo sapiens, should somehow be equipped to discover authentic, objective truths about the universe.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's also important to distinguish between, one of my criticisms of Descartes has always been, and not to say that I disagree with him, but the criticism that comes to mind that may or may not have an answer is to say that, of course, conceptually, if I'm certain of something, then I think it's true. And it's impossible to know something unless it's true. But in this epistemological project of trying to doubt everything that's possible, I think that all Descartes is really establishing here is what he cannot doubt. What are the things which it's impossible for a person to doubt? If it's impossible to doubt it, obviously we're going to think that thing is true, but I'm not sure that Descartes has established truth. I think he's established what it's impossible to doubt, what you can be certain of, which, as I said earlier, I don't think is quite the same thing. Now, I don't know if Descartes reflected heavily on this distinction, whether he thought he was doing one or the other, and I don't know if you have a view on that, but I think it's an important undertone.
It is, and the distinction you're drawing is very important, because we don't want science, knowledge, to be based just on a psychological fact.
Exactly, yeah.
That we are strongly inclined to believe X.
Yeah.
We want I think Descartes does offer an answer, namely that when I am convinced, spontaneously convinced of the truth of, let's say, 2 + 3 = 5, it's not that my feeling makes it true or makes it certain. It's rather the nature of the thing itself, as he puts it.
Because in a way, the certainty that Descartes has established is not just exactly a certainty that 2 + 3 is 5, but if you like, the certainty that that is true.
Yes.
And so he has sort of established a certainty in truth.
Yes. And I mean, I think we'd say that it's the nature of the mathematical properties themselves that means that 2 and 2 have got to make 4.
Yes.
So, and this very much connects with his later proof of God's existence in the 5th meditation, when he says that it's not my wanting it to be the case. When, for example, I say the angles of a triangle equal 180.
Yes.
It's not that I make it so or that I dream it up. Rather, it's when I contemplate this triangle, I say, yes, it's got to be. The nature of the triangle itself, the essence, how the triangle is defined, means this property has got to follow. Similarly, he says, it's not that I'm putting existence into God. Rather, the very nature of the essence of God, how he's defined, if you like, means that his perfections have got to include the perfection of existence.
Yeah, crucially, and this I will talk about this, the dreaded ontological argument in Cartesian form. Crucially, I'm glad we're doing this first rather than afterwards, is to point out that there is a really important difference between like an epistemic tool and like metaphysics, the truth of the matter, right? It may be the case that the way we establish certainty is through a mental exercise. We might think P is certainly true because I've used some mental exercise that establishes the truth of P. That does not mean that P is true because I think it's true, right? That's not the same thing. So crucially, I mean, if you think about a triangle and you think about the fact that it's got 3 sides, right? If you reflect on that in your mind, yeah, that's true. Triangles have 3 sides. Why is that? You think it just does. Or those angles add up to 180 degrees if you don't like the definition problem of triangles, okay? It just does. And it's not that I've invented that, in a way that I'm sort of arrested by the truth of it when I reflect on it. You know, it's the same thing, why can't something be true and false at the same time? Laws of logic. They just can't be. Why not? Because when I reflect on it, I'm just arrested by its truth. That doesn't mean that I have thought the law of logic into existence. It just means the way that I've established my certainty in it is through my inability to think of the opposite, right? So with that caveat, and I just want to really stress for our listeners, you know, to say that like my inability to conceive of something means it's impossible does not mean it's impossible because I can't conceive of it. It means that I can't conceive of it because it's impossible. That in mind, Descartes' ontological argument. Why does he revisit the question of God in Meditation 5?
It's an interesting question why he thinks he needs a second proof.
Yeah,
if the first one's done the job. But I think the point is, at this stage, he's entitled to be sure, he thinks, that he will have the kind of knowledge that's founded on clear and distinct perceptions. So it's going to be the kind of knowledge we see in mathematics, his favored model for knowledge, whereas we were just saying in the case of 2 + 3 = 5, the nature of the thing itself is so clear that it forces my assent, really. And so he's now going to produce a proof of God that has that same quality. As he puts it in the 4th meditation, from a great light in the intellect, there follows a great propensity of the will. And when I see something, a mathematical theorem, so clearly, I just got to say, yes, it's true.
Yes.
Because the clarity attaches to the thing itself, not to my subjective inability to doubt. Now, in the case of God, he's reasoning, God is defined as the sum of all perfections. Existence is a perfection, therefore God exists. So you can no more prize existence off the concept of God than you can prize angles equal 180 away from the concept of the triangle. Well, personally, I think, well, not just personally, but few people I think have been wholly convinced.
Mm-hmm.
Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century rejected the ontological argument, and I think he got it right. Roughly, he's saying, yes, existence, you can define God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived.
Mm-hmm.
That was Anselm's definition in his version, earlier version of the ontological argument. And existence will seem to follow from that.
Yeah.
But all you've shown is that existence is linked to that concept of that than which nothing greater can be conceived, perfection.
Mm-hmm.
You haven't shown that anything actually qualifies for that title in the first place. And I think as far as my own view is concerned, that criticism is ultimately right.
Yeah, well, my listeners will know that I place a lot of stock in the ontological argument. I think it's great fun, and I think it's got a lot, at the very least, it's got more plausibility than people give it credit for. But I never talk about Descartes' version because I find it to be the weakest. I mean, you just said that God is defined by Descartes as the sum of all perfections. People will immediately say, that might not be a great definition of God. But okay, back to what we said earlier. Forget the word God. Let's just prove that there exists this being who is the sum of all perfections. And call it God if you like, up to you. Okay, so what is a perfection? I guess one way we could define it would be like, doesn't have any limitation. So unlimited in knowledge, unlimited in power, unlimited in love. And Descartes wants to say, therefore, also unlimited in existence. And importantly for Descartes, like there are levels of existence, and for the scholastics before him who would have dominated the schooling that he had. For Aristotle, the redness of a telephone box exists, and the telephone box also exists. But the redness has like less existence because it relies on the telephone box, whereas the telephone box has existence in itself. So there are like degrees of existence. So for Descartes, we're just imagining this being of all perfections, which is to say no limits. So no limit in power, no limit in love, and no limit in existence, which means he exists. And that means that if you're imagining this being, which everyone at home should be doing by now, you're just picturing this being in your head, well, you're picturing a being that has maximal existence, which means that being exists. So you've just established the existence of God. And the first thing people always say is, you can't just think God into existence. You can't just have a thought and therefore God exists. But remember what we said a moment ago. It's not that my thinking makes God exist. It's that the sort of clarity of the thought establishes the truth which arrests me when I reflect on it. And the truth that a being which exists arrests me when I think of a God a perfect being who must possess existence.
Indeed, I think that's a very fair way of putting what Descartes himself would say. He actually says in the fifth meditation, my thought imposes no necessity on things.
Exactly.
Rather, it's the nature of the thing itself that means that whenever I focus on this concept of supreme perfection, I'm obliged to acknowledge that existence must be part of that. Well, it may be an inseparable part of it, but we also want to know, I think this is what the critic's going to say, whether in actuality there is any being who qualifies for this title.
Yes.
Once you grant him the title, then he'd have to exist, to put it crudely. But there may be nothing that so qualifies.
And of course, I mean, it makes sense to think, it almost feels like a bit of a trick, but I think people say the ontological argument is sort of circular, just defining God. And in a way, the advocate wants to say, well, yeah, because all deductive syllogisms are, in a sense, circular, they're tautological. And all we're really doing is reflecting on the nature of God. And by definition, he exists. So yeah, in a way, we are just defining God into existence. And so it sort of seems a little bit plausible, but then people start thinking, okay, well then, can't I just define all kinds of objects? So let me just conceive of, the unicorn which exists. Everybody just imagine the concept of the unicorn which exists. well, if you're imagining the concept of the unicorn which exists, then it must exist. So this unicorn you're imagining must exist, right? This is an important criticism of Descartes' ontological argument. How might Descartes respond to that?
That, I think, is a matter of distinguishing between concepts which you just cobble together.
Mm-hmm.
I've got the existing unicorn, or even the unicorn, actually, horse plus horn. I can cobble them together, but then I can take them apart again. Whereas in the case of the triangle, which is a genuine geometrical entity, an ens verum, as Descartes puts it, a true entity, not meaning it exists, but just it's a true mathematical object. I can't decide for myself what to add and what to subtract.
Yeah.
Again, as you were saying earlier, the nature of the thing itself requires me to draw certain.
The 180 degrees of a triangle is not something that you can just, add to it. Oh, let's make it 190. You can't do that. It's you're forced into doing it. But with a unicorn, I can say the unicorn that's blue, the unicorn that's got 3 legs, the unicorn that exists. I'm just making stuff up. It's not like forced by the concept, right? And I think importantly here, we also need to distinguish between something's essence and something's existence. And we'll try to do this as briefly as possible, but as far as I understand it, something's essence is what makes it what it is. So say this chair, for example, what makes this a chair? Well, the fact that it holds things up, the fact that it's got legs, the fact that, all of this kind of stuff. Once I've established the essence of the chair, I can then separately consider the question, does it exist? Same with the unicorn. The unicorn has an essence, and whether or not it exists, the essence of the unicorn doesn't change.
It can be added or subtracted to the essence.
Exactly.
Whereas in the case of God alone, this is the exception. In the case of this supreme perfection alone, according to Descartes, you don't have the choice of whether to add or subtract existence. It's got to be there. And of course, Aquinas in the 13th century had defined God as ipsum esse, existence itself. So there is something there, I think, which is perhaps retains an appeal, this idea of pure actuality. It's indefinable, almost incomprehensible notion. Actually being here, actually existing.
I think it's not a bad defense to say, say this table or this book or the unicorn. All of these things are things which have essences. They have things which make them a table. Even the thing that doesn't exist, like the unicorn, or the imaginary table, a different table that we're imagining, it has an essence. It's got legs. It holds things up in the mind, And adding existence to it doesn't change its essence. Whereas this conceptual being that we're being asked to imagine by Descartes, the sum of all perfections, because it has existence as part of its essence, it's not the kind of thing that you can say, I'm imagining the essence of this perfect being, and then there's an open question whether it exists or not, because its existence is part of its essence. Whereas I can imagine the table or the unicorn or anything else at all, and then I can ask whether or not it exists. This is the one thing that you can't do that for, because its existence is part of its essence. And in fact, for many people, a good definition of God is he or that which has existence as part of or as its essence. Right? That's kind of what God is for people like Descartes.
That's what I was suggesting, really, with the Thomistic definition of existence itself. Yes, I think that it's nice to find someone who finds something to be said for the ontological argument, because it's not found many adherents. But there is something about the thought, I think, that once you have a concept of God, you're dealing with something that couldn't just happen to be around. It might not. Once you've reached the concept of God, you've reached something that is the source of all reality, source of all existence, source of all goodness. And therefore, as it were, I think this is the essence argument, by its very nature, it's not something which happens to be here.
Yes. And also consider the context in which this argument comes up. As we said, this is Meditation 5. Descartes has already, in Meditation 3, established God's existence through what, to me, although obviously it's an argument with its problems, is a lot less of a sort of you're playing a little trick on us. Oh, it's a circular word game. It's an argument that stands or fails. And so in a way I could say, look, Descartes already established God's existence. He already knows God exists. So now by the time it's meditation 5, yeah, he is just reflecting on the definition and arguing in a circle. But what's the problem? He knows he exists. So now he's just sort of reflecting on God's nature. In the same way that Anselm's original ontological argument, in scare quotes, comes from his proslogion, which was not a work of philosophy. It's a prayer. Anselm is just reflecting on God's nature, and that's where these ontological arguments come up.
That's true. I mean, that's more apparent, I think, in Anselm than it is in Descartes.
I think so too.
As you rightly say, Anselm begins by expressing his puniness, his humility before this greatness of God, and asks that from a position of faith, he seeks understanding.
Yes. Whereas Descartes is the definition of starting with ego.
Well, yes. Although he did say that although in the order of discovery he comes first, in the order of reality God comes first. So I don't think he's quite turning the tables.
It's a beautiful way of putting it. And where is it that Descartes? You quoted earlier Descartes saying, let's just pause for a moment to reflect on the.
Yeah, that's the final paragraph of the third meditation.
Yeah. So at that point, he's already thinking in terms of maybe we just need to take a moment to just reflect on the majesty of this.
I think he's almost in Anselmian mode, actually.
Yeah. And I just wonder, even if it's not entirely clear, or maybe even if he wasn't doing this quite on purpose, I wondered the extent to which that might be present in Meditation 5 as well, wherein, I can't remember the syntax, I can't remember how it's put forward, but for a lot of people, the reason why they don't like the ontological argument is because they're I'm not convinced by that. But as Plantinga says of his modal ontological argument, it's not for you. It's not for people who don't believe in God to convince you. It's for people who do believe in God to justify that belief.
Yes. I think there's elements of that in Descartes, but I think he also wanted to say that he was doing the kind of philosophy that would carry conviction anywhere, irrespective of whether you're a believer or not. And certainly would, as he put it in the interview with Berman, would appeal to anyone, even the Turks. That's to say, those who weren't in the Christian tradition.
Yeah. Okay. So we've done a bit of a tour de force of the meditations. We've been talking about Descartes more broadly, but we've roughly gone through the sort of meditations. The first is the skeptical method. The second is the cogito. The third is the trademark argument. What's the fourth? The fourth
is about the relation between the intellect and the will, which I think connects with what we were talking about, the idea that a great light in the intellect leads to spontaneous assent of the will.
Then we get number 5, which is this ontological argument, as well as material existence. There's one more meditation in this text, the 6th, which is about the mind
and the body.
Descartes is probably second most famous for his so-called Cartesian dualism, this mind-body distinction. I wonder if, since we're doing an intro to Descartes, whether it might be worth just touching on that before we round up.
Yes. Well, we've left to the end what's possibly the part of Descartes' philosophy that attracts the most attention nowadays. He's a dualist, that's to say he divides reality into 2 fundamental categories, res cogitans, thinking stuff, and res extensa, whatever can be measured or quantified, whatever has length, breadth, and height. The second category is the basis of his whole of physics, his mathematical physics. So it's a world of measurable particles whose size, shape, motion, speed you can assess. That's the world of physics, and I think we still have that conception. And then we have the world of conscious thought, which for Descartes consists of intellect and will, in the way we've been discussing in connection with the cogito. And so what's the relation between those 2 very distinct things? Descartes is a dualist, that's to say he thinks these are 2 really incompatible notions. You can quantify any physical object, the table, the chair, atoms, particles. You can't quantify the mind. You can't measure it. But his view that the mind is an immaterial substance is one which I think it's hard for us to accept these days, because we seem to be so clearly aware that what's doing the thinking is a human being possessed of a very complex nervous system and brain, a brain consisting of millions and millions of neural connections. So the idea that thought could be the property of an immaterial substance or soul is, I think, lost a lot of its appeal for us. But since we've got on to Descartes' dualism, let me just add a point which I think is not sufficiently adverted to by those who study Descartes now, namely that although he says that mind and the body are two distinct things, he also, in the sixth meditation, says that they're united. And when they are united, very interesting things happen. We have emergent properties, namely feelings, emotions, sensations, which are not really pure thoughts. They're not pure cogitations, but nor are they mere physiological reactions. They somehow straddle that category. And so my view on this is that although Descartes has only two substances, mind and body, he has three kinds of attribute or qualities: purely mental attributes like thinking and willing, purely physical attributes like your stomach rumbling or your blood pressure or whatever. But then there's this third category of attributes, thoughts and sensations, feelings, passions, which are psychophysical. They involve conscious awareness, but they also involve physical stuff, as we say, being churned up about something. Which is an interesting phrase, because it implies it's not just a pure abstract thought. There's a bodily component too, which has a particular kind of urgency.
Am I right in thinking that Descartes connected the mind to the pineal gland in the brain? Is that like an urban legend? Is that something that he really did?
No, he did. That's what Daniel Dennett, the American philosopher who just died recently, called the fax machine to the soul. It's where all the physical neural impulses come, and then in the pineal gland in the middle of the brain, they somehow are perceived or transmitted to the soul.
How did Descartes, how much did Descartes know about the science of the brain as we would consider it today?
It's very crude by today's standards. He thought of the nerves as little pipes filled with gas, which he called the animal spirits. So he had no conception of the staggering. He was very interested in physiology and in the nervous system, but no real conception of the staggering complexity of the cerebral cortex.
But he had some idea of how the brain worked, to the extent that he knew that this pineal gland was... He sort of knew roughly what its function was in the brain. I really don't know where the science of the brain was at that point.
I think it's pretty crude. He just wants a single point where the images from the two eyes come together.
Right.
I think it doesn't really cut much ice with us now. What I think is an interesting argument is that he says that a mechanism, a physical mechanism, always has a finite number of inputs and outputs. But thought, he says, is open-ended. It's not based on one-one correlations, input, output, input, output. Today you've uttered sentences you've never uttered before. You've had thoughts which you've never had before in exactly that form. So the mind is creative, innovative, and he thought, therefore, it can't be produced by a physical organ, however complicated. And actually, he has a sort of empirical argument for that. He says you just couldn't fit in enough enough mechanisms into that space. But of course, it's an interesting question. Had he known that there were hundreds of millions of neural connections,
would he have thought that was enough?
And would he have still had this argument? But I think he comes out as in pretty good shape, I think, by today's standards, because that's still quite a compelling argument for the creativity of the mind and how physical mechanisms don't seem to have that capacity.
Yeah. Okay, so then 2 questions to round up this mind-body stuff. First, we've just talked at length about Descartes believing that there's a mind that's separable from a body, but we didn't talk about why he believes that. I mean, in the 6th meditation, he gives a relatively straightforward, again, sort of, remember, we're on the skeptical journey of things that we can doubt, like what does our reason reveal to us? Why does Descartes land on this idea that the mind and the body are distinct things?
The basic argument, which occurs in the Discourse on the Method, written a few years before the Meditations, is that, to put it crudely, I can think of myself without the body. I can conceive of myself waking up without my body in the next world, perhaps. I can imagine, or think at least it's logically possible that I could still be me, this thinking being, even though there was no body. Some people still buy that argument. Richard Swinburne, who I think you've interviewed on your program, thinks it's a good argument and has a very sophisticated modern version of it. My view is that it doesn't work. The fact that I think I can conceive of myself without my body existing doesn't, I think, prove that I could really continue to be me and to think and to discuss and to meditate without my body, which would include without my brain. After all, we often make mistakes about what could happen without what. I could perhaps imagine or think I can imagine this water without there being any hydrogen and oxygen.
Quite right, yeah.
But unbeknownst to me, if I'm ignorant of chemistry, it just can't be there without the hydrogen and the oxygen. That's what it is.
Yeah. You can imagine, I mean, you can imagine somebody who like didn't know that water was made of hydrogen and oxygen, even like outside of the context of water itself, thinking to themselves, for some reason, they were like, imagine a possible world in which the only thing that existed was, the ocean, but there was no hydrogen, and they didn't even realize that those questions were connected. You can conceive of that. You can conceive of there being, no hydrogen atoms at the center of stars and stuff, but there's just a bunch of water. But without realizing it, you have undermined the thing. I mean, yes. I think the argument's powerful, and it's worth pointing out to people as well that like Descartes isn't trying to say that like the mind is distinct from the body because like I'm sort of imagining them as being distinct. I just know that they're distinct. The point is that as long as you can conceive of them being separable, that means that in principle they are separable.
It's at least it's at least logically possible that they're separable.
And so just that conceivability means that they can't, literally speaking, they can't be the same thing. Because if they were the same thing, you wouldn't be able to conceptually distinct them. Even if in practice they always come together, the conceptual distinctness is what makes Descartes think that they are actually distinct.
Yes, but I would add that it's still an open question whether that conceivability is genuine. As to say whether my conception is coherent, whether I can coherently conceive. I just add one thing, that there is some appeal, I think, to the idea that thought is abstract.
Yeah.
We're now discussing pretty abstract questions which don't appear to be connected with matter. Nonetheless, what is doing the thinking could still be a physical, namely an animal, a rational animal, a human being.
Yeah.
So although there's something to the thought that thought is an abstract process, the idea that the individual who's doing the thinking is an immaterial soul, I think is, in my view, is not proven.
Yeah, there are some important questions in that idea of like abstracting ideas. For example, I can conceive of the brownness of this chair as separable from the chair. Like I can separate those concepts in my mind, but does that mean that the brownness could sort of exist on its own?
Right. Yes.
Well, I want to say no, but then maybe kind of, because it like exists in my mind, and it all gets a bit complicated. But at the very least, I think it's fair to say that even if it is the case that if something is conceptually distinguishable, then it is really distinct. The problem is that we often just go wrong with what we think is conceptually distinguishable.
Absolutely.
And that's even granting that that is the case. It may also be the case that conceptual distinction doesn't guarantee real distinction.
Yeah, so there are all sorts of problems, I think, with Descartes' central argument for dualism. And as I say, I think it's a view that's kind of lost its appeal for us today. And my own view would be that Aristotle got it right, that the attribute of thought may be a separate kind of attribute, but it's an attribute that inheres in a human being. And a human being is a creature of flesh and blood. It's a living organism which has many properties in virtue of the way the body is configured. So I can digest in virtue of the way my stomach is configured. I can think in virtue of the way my brain is configured. That's what's known as the hylomorphic view, which Descartes thought he was rejecting, and indeed he did reject it. But arguably the Aristotelian view is the common sense view. If you say, what are you? I think it'd be very odd to say, I'm a soul. It'd be equally odd to say, I'm a body. I think the right answer is neither. I'm not a soul, as Descartes thought. I'm not a body, as sort of reductionist materialists think. Rather, I'm a human being. A creature of flesh and blood, a biological animal of a certain rather unusual kind, because we have the power of thought, but that's a power that's located in or inheres in the biological being that's a human being.
It's parts of a whole. I'm not my left side. I'm not my right side. I have to be both of them together.
Indeed.
The only question that jumps out of that from me is another really important legacy of Descartes, which I think is worth an honourable mention at the end here. Which is a few times there you said human being, rational animal, we are people. Descartes didn't extend this sort of charitable view of ensoulment far beyond the human species. Famously, Descartes, if I'm not, again, this might be an urban legend here, but I have a feeling that Descartes once attempted to prove the sort of, I guess, not inanimate, but the soullessness of animals, other animals than humans, by like cutting open a dog. And I'm not sure if that actually happened or if that's an urban myth.
He did do vivisection on rabbits and dogs. His view of animals, I think, is not as clear as is often supposed. He describes them as automata, machines, but an automaton in the 17th century just meant a self-moving mechanism. Now, what he clearly and unequivocally denies of animals is thought, the power of thinking, cogitating, meditating, conceptual thought. And that seems to me is absolutely right. Animals don't have language, they don't have thought. As to whether they have feelings, he does talk about animal passions. He says, for example, that when a sheep sees a wolf and runs away, it has the passion of fear. He talks about passion of anger as applying to some animals. So he's not, on the face of it, denying the possibility of genuine ascriptions of feelings to animals.
And importantly, animal pain.
Yes, indeed. He thinks that's explicable in terms of physiology, but to explain something in terms of physiological mechanisms is not to eliminate it. So I think Descartes' position, actually, perhaps we can end on this note, is rather more subtle and interesting than the crude denier of feelings to animals that he's often represented as being.
As is so often the case in the history of philosophy, it's more complicated than it seems at first glance. And I'm so glad that this podcast gives us an opportunity to start unpacking things like that. John Cottingham, this has been a wonderful, wonderful introduction to Descartes. I've learned, even having thoroughly studied your works during my university degree and afterwards, I've still learnt dozens of new things just from talking to you now. So thank you so much for the time.
Thank you. Very much enjoyed it, and thank you for your very interesting and apt questions, which I hope have produced some interesting thoughts for our viewers.
We'll see what they think. Like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments. Your book Jesus and divine Christology. Christology, of course, being the study of the nature of Jesus. My followers might know that I recently partook in a debate about Christology, about whether or not Jesus claims to be God as a historical figure. Your book is about that topic, specifically in the first three Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels. And you open this book by describing a paradox in biblical scholarship. What is that paradox?
The paradox has to do with two related fields of study. One of them would be the field of historical Jesus research, which is its own area of research where scholars set out to try to ascertain what Jesus of Nazareth, the man, really did and said. And the other one is the study of early Christology, like the Christological beliefs of the early church, and Paul, the early New Testament authors, about the human or divine character of Jesus. And so my own area of research has been primarily in historical Jesus research, although I'm fascinated by anything in the New Testament and Scripture as a whole. One of the things I noticed over the years was that if you look at the field of historical Jesus research going all the way back to the 18th century, some of the founding figures like Reimarus and David Friedrich Strauss in the 19th century, the quest really originates almost as with an axiomatic assumption that the historical Jesus, by definition, is a figure who did not make divine self-claims, right? So you can just see this all over the literature. Albert Schweitzer talks about it in his famous work, The Quest of the Historical Jesus. He kind of begins with this statement that the quest was setting about to strip Jesus of the supernatural nimbus with which he had been surrounded and to look at him as merely a man. And so Schweitzer said that the quest, although it's called the historical quest, also had a kind of theological aim, which was to actually call into question the dogma of the two natures, that Jesus is both divine and human. And so from that day until now, there's been an almost kind of reflexive reluctance to even raise the question of whether the historical Jesus claimed to be divine, because historical Jesus research is almost characterized by definition as examining this merely human figure, right? So one of the examples I give in the book is if you look at the handbook for the historical Jesus, which came out about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, which is 4,000 pages, which is not exactly a handbook, but there's no articles in it on whether Jesus claimed to be divine. It's almost a kind of an assumption that he didn't. Yet, when you switch over into early Christology, the study of early Christology by figures like Bart Ehrman or Richard Bauckham, Paula Fredrickson, whoever it might be, in the last 20 years or so, there's been a kind of burgeoning recognition or a kind of burgeoning position known as the Early High Christology Club, namely this recognition that Christology did not necessarily start out low, like merely human Jesus, and then gradually elevate to the status of divine, but rather was divine from the beginning. So we have an early high or early divine Christology in the writings of Paul, as well as other New Testament authors. And so as I was kind of working through these two fields, one of the things that it brought to my attention was a paradox. In other words, if the historical Jesus never claimed to be divine, which is kind of the working hypothesis of the majority, not all, but the majority of historical Jesus scholars since the 18th and 19th centuries, then how is it that the earliest Christians, especially who are all Jewish Christians like Paul, went from a merely human Jesus to very early on, if not immediately, a divine Christology, treating him, speaking about him as if he were, in some sense, equal with the one God of Israel. You can think here of 1 Corinthians 8, for example, where Paul talks about there is one God and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things exist, right? So he takes the language of the Shema, and Deuteronomy 6 takes the language of creation, and he kind of, in a sense, folds Jesus into the Shema as early as 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And so the question is,
what is the Shema?
I'm sorry. The Shema is the Hebrew word for hear. It's an allusion to Deuteronomy 6 when God, through Moses, commands the Israelites, "Hear, O Israel, Shema Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." So that's the kind of classic Jewish monotheistic axiom that was also part of daily Jewish prayer. And so Paul's taking up that language of the Jewish confession of belief in one God and somehow folding the man Jesus of Nazareth into it, into what scholars are going to talk about as Christological monotheism. It's a monotheism, but it's also one that seems to speak of this human being, Jesus of Nazareth, as divine, or in some sense equal with the one God of Israel. So my paradox at the beginning of the book is, if Jesus doesn't claim to be God during his earthly life, how do you get to divine Christology so quickly in the early church? Now, there are lots of different answers to that. Some people will say, well, it was the resurrection that led to the divinization of Jesus by the early Christians. And that's not an unreasonable claim, although it does have some problems. For example, there were other figures who had believed to have been raised from the dead, like John the Baptist or Jairus' daughter or Lazarus. But no one divinizes them or seems to believe that they're divine. So resurrection would be a kind of necessary condition for belief in his divinity, but not a sufficient one, at least in my opinion. Other people will say, well, he was divinized because of the messianic claims he made, but that's problematic as well, because to simply claim to be the Messiah doesn't necessarily mean that you made a divine claim, because Mashiach, Messiah, is just the anointed king of Israel. So what I wanted to do in this book is kind of test the hypothesis, which is my basic thesis that I'm arguing, is that the reason the first Christians, who were all Jewish Christians at the beginning, made divine claims about Jesus immediately after his death, his crucifixion, is because Jesus of Nazareth himself had already been making divine claims about himself during his lifetime, with the caveat that he does it in a very Jewish way, right? But claims to be divine, not by making an explicit claim, hey, everyone, I'm God, or hey, everyone, I'm the second person of the Trinity, or some kind of anachronistic formulation, but rather he does it in a Jewish way using riddles, mashalim, parables, allusions, especially allusions to Jewish scriptures, key Jewish scriptures like the Shema or the Decalogue, and in a way that invites his audience into this mystery, kind of apocalyptic secret of his divine messianism. His identity is not just an earthly Messiah, but a more than earthly Messiah, a superhuman Messiah, a divine Messiah. So that's my argument in the book, is I want to look at certain passages and see whether Jesus is claiming to be divine, but in a Jewish way. And I think if you do that, if you look at passages, I look at 12 episodes in the book, 10 from the Synoptics, 2 from John. But if you look at those passages through an ancient Jewish lens, in light of Second Temple Jewish eschatology and Second Temple Jewish messianism, I actually think that there's a strong case to be made for ample evidence that Jesus spoke and acted as if he was divine within his lifetime. So that's kind of the basic argument of the book. I try to solve that paradox of low historical Jesus Christology, so to speak, high early Christian Christology, by positing a historical connection between the two. To use E.P. Sanders' claim, following Joseph Klausner, this Jewish scholar who said, ex nihilo nihil fit, right? Nothing comes from nothing. So the smoke of divine Christology in the early church comes from the fire of Jesus's own divine messianism. That's what I'm testing in the book. That's what I want to explore. Because there's just been a dearth of research on it. It's fascinating. You'd think there'd be book after book after book on the historical Jesus and whether he claimed to be divine. But in modern period, in 20th century in particular, there's just not a lot of work being done on that, because it's almost a kind of a working assumption in the field of historical Jesus.
Yeah, well, that's why I found your book so interesting, but also useful in preparing for this debate that I had, because it was a new case for high Christology, and in the Synoptics as well. And I found that really, really crucial. But also, like, to help me score a point here,
Sure.
Sometimes in a popular context, like when I go and do a debate, and I say that Jesus never even claimed to be God, which is a separate question from whether he was God, right? We're talking about whether he actually even made the claim historically that he's God.
Yeah.
A lot of the time, Christians kind of look at me like I've said that a triangle has 4 sides, as if I've said something so unbelievably absurd that it's not just wrong and unchristian, but how could anybody believe this? But to be clear, this is quite a mainstream, like, scholarly idea about the historical Jesus, right?
Absolutely. And in fact, I would support your point by pointing out that if you ask many Christians, do you believe Jesus is God? They'll say, well, yes, of course. And then you say, okay, why do you believe he's God? And give me passages from the Gospels supporting the claim that he claimed to be God. Some people might actually be hard pressed, especially if you said just restricted to the Synoptics, because many Christians will often go to John 8, right? Before Abraham was, I am, or John 10, 33, right? I and the Father are one. But if you said, okay, well, can we bracket John for a second? Where in the synoptics does Jesus explicitly claim to be God? That's actually a much harder question to answer without some thought or without having thought about it in advance, because it's just a fact, and it's one of the premises of my book, is that Jesus does not explicitly claim to be divine in the way that we moderns might want, in a kind of univocal sense, right? I am God, with a subject and a predicate and everything clearly spelled out. No, that's the whole reason why William Rada, back in the early 20th century, could write a book called The Messianic Secret. And even in John, we see Jesus's contemporaries say, if you are the Messiah, tell us plainly, right? There's an element of mystery. There's an element of riddle-like quality to his speech. Jesus far more frequently asks questions than gives answers. So it is actually a challenging thing to say, if you were pressed to demonstrate from the synoptics that Jesus claimed to be God, what passages would you look at? And I think actually, I'm not saying no Christian could answer that, but it's a more challenging question than some people might at first assume. Of course, Jesus is God, right? From the Christian perspective.
Well, they'll point to all kinds of things. Like you say, John's gospel is littered with I think 3 really important Christological claims, also including John 14.
Sure.
Anyone who's seen me has seen the Father, right?
But
throughout the synoptics, Christians will also, if they do know a little bit about what they're talking about, they'll say, well, Jesus forgiving sins, and you've got Jesus walking on the water and calming the storm and doing things that only God can do. And I'm not trying to make the case that there's no argument to be made there, but I want people to understand that both of these positions are plausible, let's say, and that, well, maybe you don't think it's plausible, but I mean they are both have been historically thought plausible by serious scholars. It's not some. I'll grant credit where it's due. I do sometimes on this podcast stray into the more esoteric and conspiratorial aspects of Christian history, Gnostic Gospels, and whether the Gospel of Thomas is earlier than Mark, and I have a bit of fun with that. But with this, it's actually a quite serious mainstream debate.
Absolutely, no, there's no doubt. And I would say that I'd put it this way: it's understandable that someone could read the synoptics and not walk away necessarily thinking, well, Jesus obviously claimed to be God, because, and this is a really crucial part of my book. There's a chapter, I think it's chapter 4, called The Apocalyptic Secret. And one of the things I'm trying to emphasize in the book is that it is a widely agreed upon consensus, and I think it's right, that Jesus was not just a Jewish prophet, he was an apocalyptic prophet, right? There was a particular strain of Judaism which emphasized apocalypsis, the unveiling or revealing of invisible heavenly mysteries to earthly human beings, right? Whether it's about mysteries about the end of time, like eschatology, or heavenly realities, like in the book of Enoch or 4th Ezra. And so moderns in particular, sometimes we want to eliminate that element of mystery, but I don't think that that's the right way to go about answering this question. I think it would do a disservice to the Gospels themselves if we tried to make Jesus' statement less mysterious than they actually are. So I do think it's reasonable to walk away from, for example, Jesus. One of the passages I look at is the healing of the paralytic. You brought it up already, right? Where Jesus says in Mark 2 to the paralyzed man, "My son, your sins are forgiven," right? Now, you can make a reasonable case, that Jesus is just taking a priestly prerogative upon himself. Because it is true that in the temple, Jewish priests would bring sacrifices, they'd offer them to the God of Israel, and they would sacrifice those in order to atone for the sins of the people on their behalf. And so you could make the case that kind of divine passive, your sins are forgiven, is just Jesus making or taking a priestly prerogative as his own, right?
Yeah, that's something Bart Ehrman points out, that
position, right?
Jesus doesn't say, I forgive you. He just says passively, your sins are forgiven.
That's exactly right. So I do agree with you. Like, that's not an unreasonable interpretation of that passage. Now, I don't think that does full justice to the passage. I think more is going on than just a priestly prerogative. I think Jesus is laying claim to a divine prerogative. And I think the text itself supports that, both because even within a Jewish context, the priest would not declare your sins forgiven. He would be the mediation of forgiveness. But even more, it's because of Jesus' response. Because when they respond by saying, who can forgive sins but God alone? You notice the response is not, who can forgive sins but priests alone? But they actually make it an exclusively divine prerogative, the Jewish interlocutors. And then Jesus responds by saying, so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, I say to you, rise, take up your pallet and walk. So I think the fuller context of the passage makes that reasonable interpretation, not the best interpretation of the overall content. So yeah, I do think that those are reasonable positions from the synoptics, precisely because these are complex matters, and it is his identity in the Gospels is a mystery. It's not just univocal. It's not just laid out there for all to see. There is an element of mystery here, which the Gospels themselves testify to. In Matthew 16, when Jesus says, flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. Apocalypto is the Greek term, but my Father in heaven. So I think those are fair to walk away with different interpretations of what are clearly mysterious passages.
So someone in your position, as it were, has to take seriously the prospect of the scholarly challenge that Jesus never claimed to be God. Someone in my position has to accept that if Jesus were to claim to be God, it might not be in the way that we want. It might be in an extremely Jewish way, and it might also be in a non-straightforward way, or in a way that would require the kind of familiarity that Jesus might have expected his followers to have with the Hebrew Bible, for example, in order to understand what he was doing. So with those things granted, maybe we can just dive into some of these examples. I mean, we were just talking about the forgiving of sins, and that's often where people start because it's so early in Mark's gospel. And Mark is, as far as we think, our earliest gospel. It's seems to be a source for Matthew and Luke, who take almost all of Mark's gospel and then add a few bits more. So Mark's gospel has Jesus sort of surrounded by crowds, and there's this famous story where there's a paralytic man who cannot get to Jesus. So they climb up on the roof and they lower him through the roof onto the ground. Yeah. And Jesus tells this man, your sins are forgiven. Right? And it's the scribes who are nearby who, the first weird thing is that they're thinking.
Yeah.
This man is blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And Jesus hears their thoughts. Now, some people like to point to that immediately. I look at that and say, look, if Jesus were just a miracle-working prophet, he could probably do something like that. So, but it's interesting. And they say, why? This man is blaspheming, which is interesting because blasphemy seems to be taking on godly prerogatives. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And like you say, Jesus doesn't say, well, I am God. Jesus says, why are you thinking these things? He says, as you say, so you know that the Son of Man has the authority to forgive sins on earth. And he makes the man walk because he says, which is easier to say?
Yes,
your sins are forgiven, or take up your mat and walk.
Yeah.
But so you know the Son of Man has the authority to forgive sins, I tell him, take up your mat and walk. And he gets up and he goes away. And everyone's kind of amazed by this. Now, the Orthodox Christian reading of this is that the scribes were correct. Yes, only God can forgive sins, and Jesus proved to them that the Son of Man is God. My reading of this story is different for a few reasons, and I want to know what you think of this.
Yeah, sure.
The first is that the whole motif of Jesus's Jewish opponents in the gospel seems to be that they're constantly misunderstanding him. They're constantly getting things wrong. I'm not sure if there is a good biblical foundation for the idea that only God can forgive sins. God does forgive sins, but this kind of rule that exists, that only God can forgive sins, I'm unclear about what the sort of biblical basis is for this. And at any rate, Jesus then says, so you know that the Son of Man has the authority to forgive sins on earth. I'm going to do this, which doesn't immediately say, I'm God. It says, well, no, I have this authority as well. Jesus also throughout the Gospels talks a lot about how he's been given certain authorities and prerogatives by the Father. He's given the power to judge mankind by the Father, that kind of stuff. Right. And so even if this is a godly prerogative, it may be something that God has simply given to Jesus. But the real nail in the coffin here for me is at the end of John's Gospel, Jesus sends out his disciples, right? And he says to his disciples, as the Father has sent me, now I am sending you. If you forgive people's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive their sins are retained. So he seems to give the disciples the ability to forgive sins. And if only God can forgive sins, then lucky disciples, I suppose. And some Christians say, yeah, but those disciples went out and they forgave people in the name of Jesus,
Sure.
right? They did it on Jesus' authority. Okay, but what does Jesus say to them? As the Father has sent me, now I'm sending you. So in the same way that they're forgiving in the name of Jesus, Jesus is forgiving in the name of God. That's a lot to start with. I'm going to throw that at you. See what sticks.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Okay. Yeah. This is a great question. So I'll make a couple of points. First, you're right that there's no explicit rule in Hebrew scripture that says only God can forgive sins, full stop. Okay. However, it's not a minority interpretive position. For example, in Leviticus chapter 4, early chapters of Leviticus, which are describing atoning sacrifices, the kind of sin offerings, as they're called. You'll see this over and over again. It's a refrain. The priest will offer the sacrifice and his sins shall be forgiven, shall be forgiven, shall be forgiven. The world expert on Leviticus, Jacob Milgram, great Jewish scholar, wrote a 3,000-page commentary on Leviticus. I've got it up here. He actually points out that use of divine passive in the Hebrew, as well as the whole sacrificial system within Judaism, actually does. He takes the position that it is implying that the act of forgiving sin, precisely because sin is not just an offense against other humans, but above all, always an offense against the Lord, against the God of Israel, is in fact an exclusively divine prerogative. And that's why the divine passive is used over and over as a refrain in the Levitical descriptions of priestly activity. It's never the priest who is described as forgiving, but always the divine passive. Another passage would be Isaiah 43, which is one of the really high monotheistic passages in the Old Testament, where you see the Lord saying, I am he, using that biblical language echoing the Exodus passage. And he says, he who forgives your sins, right? So there's an affirmation of God's ability to forgive sin in the context of emphasizing his exclusivity as the one God and as the God who is the creator, the one creator. There's no other God beside me. It's a whole monotheistic passage. So when you take those two passages together, I actually do think there is some scriptural foundation for the inference. It's an inference. It's not a text in scripture. That in a Jewish context, it was understood that the positive act of forgiving sin was something that could only be done by God alone. So I actually don't think that the scribes in this case are misinterpreting the implication of Jesus's action. In fact, I think the whole point of him responding, so that you may know the Son of Man has authority on earth, is to affirm what they're saying, but describing himself as having that divine authority. Now, so I do think in his context, in that Jewish context, they're not wrong about that. Now, can God delegate divine power or divine authority? And the answer is yes, 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 and yes. Right. So I do think it would be wrong to then argue that can't ever be delegated to a human being. And you're absolutely right. We're going to see Jesus delegate that authority to the apostles in John chapter 20. So it's a nuanced position. I'm not arguing that divine power can't be delegated. I am arguing that in this context, the scribes are right to perceive Jesus as doing something which heretofore, at least, is something only the God of Israel can do. And you can see that confirmed by the way the crowds react too, when they say, we've never seen anything like this, right? So that implies that something unprecedented has just happened.
But when they say we've never seen anything like this, just not to derail, but do you think they're referring there to Jesus's forgiving of sins, or the fact that they've just seen a paralyzed man get up and walk away?
I would say it's both. Although you're absolutely right that the paralyzed man is going to be striking. I'm not minimizing that. I would say it would be a both and rather than an either or. That would be my suggestion. All right. Now, real quick though, I don't want to evade the John 20 point because that's a really important point. I do think it's crucial to emphasize here that, and I do think Christians nowadays tend to underemphasize it, although it's growing in awareness, that if you look at early Christian soteriology, for example, in 2 Peter, there is an understanding.
What's soteriology?
Soteriology is the theology or the rational analysis of soteria means salvation or to be saved or to be healed. So it's the theology of how we are saved. All right. And if you look at soteriology, for example, of 2 Peter, it talks about becoming partakers of the divine nature, right?
Yeah.
So there's this notion of theosis in the early church that I actually think goes a long way toward explaining how a divine Messiah like Jesus can then also delegate divine powers and divine, in this case, even divine nature to merely human beings. I mean, at least in 2 Peter 1, that's what he's saying. Through baptism, you actually die, not only to this world, all that, but you actually become a partaker of divinity. And this is going to be an important theme, as I'm sure you know, if you look at patristic Christology, patristic soteriology in the early church, that's there. So again, I'm not denying that there is a very high soteriology on the other side of the resurrection in both the Gospel of John and in the early New Testament epistles. However, I also think that what you're seeing in the gospel narrative here is a superhuman claim being made by Jesus when he uses, first of all, the Son of Man to refer to himself, and makes the claim to be able to do something, at least which heretofore has been viewed as a divine prerogative, namely, not to ask God to forgive their sins, not to offer a sacrifice on behalf, but simply to declare the man's sins forgiven. And not just the man, notice what he says to him, my son, your sins forgiven. That's a weird way to address, presumably, another adult male who is not actually your son. That's a strange, he'll do this throughout the Gospels. My daughter, my son. Now, these are not his students. These are just bystanders, strangers, sick people. It doesn't make a lot of sense if he's merely human. But if he's implying that he's more than just an ordinary rabbi, ordinary teacher, then there are these various hints and clues that build together toward making the claim here, in this case for sure, of not just being a son of man, like a human being, like in Psalm 8, but the Son of Man, meaning the heavenly figure that you see in the book of Daniel, who's described as receiving glory, honor, power, kingdom, and who comes on the clouds, right? Something that God does in theophanies in the Old Testament. So I think this is a good example of how, just on the surface, there are lots of different possible interpretations of, so you may know the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. But if you look at it elusively, like, what Jewish text from the Old Testament is he alluding to? And what does that Old Testament text in context reveal about the implication of who he's claiming to be? I definitely think that in this case, he is making the implicit claim to be a heavenly Messiah, like the Son of Man, who has divine power to forgive sins directly. And that's why I think the scribes in this case do not misinterpret the implications of his actions. And in fact, the whole point of the miracle is so that you may know that I have the power to perform the invisibly divine act of forgiving his sins. I'll perform the visible miracle, so to speak, of healing his body and healing his paralysis by saying, rise, take up your pallet. So that's my reading of the text.
There's a lot to be said, right? And I hope people can realize. Some people ask me, like, yeah, Alex, why are you, as an agnostic atheist guy, so interested in Christology? And it's like, just listening to you speak, you can imagine you're on the Wikipedia page trying to read, and it's like all the hyperlinks that you're clicking, all the tabs that are slowly opening, soteriology, Son of Man, all of this. It's absolutely fascinating, all of it.
It is, but I've only got simple too. In a Jewish setting, by the time you get to first century, the Danielic Son of Man figure is in early Jewish apocalyptic texts depicted in 4th Ezra or 1st Enoch, these ancient writings, as a pre-existent, superhuman, heavenly being. So there's also a resonance within Jewish circles here when Jesus alludes to these are not obscure passages in the Old Testament. These are famous passages, highly debated passages. And just like you and I might allude to a famous movie or a famous song, and we can expect the audience to pick up on it. In this case, I think that's how he's operating with his audience in Mark 2.
Yeah, we will have to talk about the Son of Man, of course. I mean, that is the greatest mystery. But just before that, I've only got maybe a couple of things to say about this.
Oh, sure, please, go ahead.
Forgiving sins business. And part of the interesting... so it's part of the fun of doing this is that a lot of the time you have multiple versions of a story, right? You've got multiple gospels telling the same story, which gives us a really good insight into, what was definitely sort of believed as to have happened, what might be embellishments of an author. And there are a few things to say. Firstly, on this son and daughter business, I do think that is kind of interesting. But that's a question that I will be hopeless to answer unless I understand, colloquial Galilean ways of speaking. I mean, I could walk down the street and a police officer might come up to me and say, "Hey, son, like, don't cross."
Especially if you're in the South in the United States, that would happen. Yeah.
So it's kind of difficult to know, but it is interesting, right? The only other things that I'd want to point out is firstly, well, it's all to do with the fact that this is in Mark's gospel, but Matthew's gospel has this story as well, of course, and in Matthew it's a little bit later, it's in chapter 9. And I want to emphasize that Matthew takes, I think it's something like 95% of Mark's gospel is just copied verbatim in Matthew's gospel. Like it's like basically the entire of Mark's gospel is reproduced with extra material, but there's just these few passages that for whatever reason, Matthew doesn't copy from Mark, just a handful of them.
Sure.
And one of them occurs in this story.
Sure. Yep.
When this story is told, Matthew removes a line. And what's the line he removes? He removes the line where the scribes say, "Who can forgive sins but God alone?" That's not in Matthew's version, which, given that he doesn't seem to remove things like willy-nilly, there seems to be an intentionality behind removing this reference to only God can forgive sins. And I wonder if that's got something to do with the developing understanding that actually that's not true, or maybe there's another explanation, maybe it's a coincidence. The only other thing I'll say, and I'll let you respond to this because it's the same story, is after this, in Matthew's version, as you say, the crowd reacts. In Matthew's version, what is it that they say? Then the man got up and went home. When the crowd saw this, they were filled with awe, and they praised God who had given such authority to a man.
Man, exactly, yes. Okay,
so
okay.
You can see how I'm going to read this, right? Like, well, Matthew's taking out this forgiveness of sins. They recognize that God has given this authority to a man. What's going on there?
Okay, so this is great. I'm so glad you brought this up because this is an important point. You'll notice one of the title, I agonized about the title for a long time. The title of the book is Divine Christology. And there's a reason for that. It wasn't just Jesus and his divinity. Because the thesis of the book, although there's a lot of emphasis on divinity, is not just that Jesus is divine simpliciter, right? Like just in its simplest form. It's that he's a divine Christ, a divine Messiah. So there's divine messianism. So there's both human and divine. And one of the challenges I've found with this is that very frequently, sometimes people will assume, well, if I'm saying he's divine, I'm some way saying he's not human. And that's, obviously, it's not the classic Catholic Christology, which is always a both and on this point. But it is understandable. So I agree with Matthew, surprise, surprise, that it is fascinating that God has given this authority to a man, because I am not saying that in Mark 2 or in Matthew's version, he's not a man. What I am saying is he's not merely a man, and that he has divine power and divine prerogatives that exceed that of a normal human being. So both responses, we've never seen anything like this, Mark, and wow, how has God given such authority to a man, are reasonable responses, because I'm arguing that Jesus is revealing through his words and actions the mystery of his, not just his divinity, as if he's a divine being who's pretending to be human or appearing as human, like maybe some of the angelic beings in the Old Testament, but actually a divine man or a divine Messiah. So I agree with your emphasis there on humanity, but I don't think it takes away from the superhuman or exalted status to which he is also laying claim implicitly.
Yeah, that's a key point, is that, like, if we're saying something like that, the reactions of the crowd is like, that's weird that a man can do that.
Yes,
it could just be because, he's not just a man, But do you have a view on why Matthew removes this reference to only God can forgive sins?
I'll be honest with you. I spent a lot of years studying the synoptic problem, studying Q at a Q library. I get more and more cautious and more agnostic about my ability to get inside the head of why an author took this out, or whether they even did or not. It's extremely complex question. The synoptic problem is the question of which author wrote first, who copied from whom, and then why did they make the changes, omissions, additions, redactions that they did. I think a lot of that is honestly beyond the limits of our ability to really know. We can guess, we can speculate. There are certain tendencies that you can definitely see if you're right about the relationship of which author is copying from which. But I'm going to pull. Is it okay if I can be agnostic on that point? I don't
Of course.
I don't know. I'm not sure. And I would,
Yeah.
so I would,
It
I
is,
would
I mean,
hesitate
it is worth pointing out that,
to
that
make
though
sense.
Matthew does remove that phrase, who can forgive sins but God alone, he does still have the scribes say, this man is blaspheming.
Absolutely.
And
So
so
the
it's difficult
response
to
is the
know
same.
how he'd be blaspheming if not on the same grounds.
And as an author too, one of the reasons I've edited now, I guess I've published now almost 10 books. Sometimes I don't even know why I omitted something or why I
Yeah,
added
right.
something. It's a very
Yeah.
complex process. So I'm always a little hesitant to guess
Yeah.
there.
I mean, there could be all kinds of. It could literally be that Matthew had a version of Mark's gospel and his eyes skipped over the verse.
And
It could be anything.
And also, too, when we say Matthew has 95% of Mark in it, or 90, more than that, it's true, but it's actually, you got to be careful because a lot of the episodes is true with regard to the episodes in Matthew and Mark, but it's not actually true with regard to a lot of the material. Oftentimes, the episode in Matthew is shorter. So you have the same pericope, but it's actually longer in Mark, like with the healing of the Gerasene demoniac. It's same episode, much longer in Mark than it is in Matthew. So Matthew actually has if you're taking the hypothesis, the two source that Mark's first and Matthew and Luke copy, Matthew actually has a habit of shortening Mark in episodes. He wants to preserve them all, but his tendency is to make them more brief. So you get more detail, more elaboration in Mark with fewer episodes. So again, it's a complicated question. So I'm not sure.
I tell you what I should do maybe at this junction, because there are paths exploding in front of me where we could go. I want to talk about the Son of Man. We can talk about worship. We can talk about walking on the water. We can talk about all of that kind of stuff. But I think I should lay out what my position is here, what my understanding is to help here. And maybe you can lay out yours too. I think you might have betrayed yourself as a Catholic given your use of Latin. I think, it's out in the open now for our listeners.
For all to see, yes.
For what it's worth, I'm quite attracted to the idea that Jesus, historically speaking, is essentially a follower of John the Baptist, a disciple of John the Baptist. And there's some evidence in the fact that Jesus is, of course, baptized by John the Baptist, and John is preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. A lot of people think that John was a type of Jew known as an Essene, because there are sort of three major Jewish groups in this time. There's the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And of course, a lot of people might not have heard of the latter group because Jesus is constantly battling with the first two, but never battles with the third. There's a lot that it's a fairly sort of well-trodden path of people who suggest this means Jesus is an Essene in the tradition of John the Baptist. John the Baptist dies. John is constantly talking about having a successor. There's one coming who's going to be greater than me. Jesus is that man. Jesus sort of continues the ministry of John the Baptist. And then what we see is Jesus preparing to pass on that ministry to his own disciples and singling out Peter as his sort of main successor. And of course, this is very unorthodox for Christians, but I'm speaking historically here. There are some clues here. Jesus is saying things to his disciples like, one day you'll do greater things than I will. He talks about teachers and students and how the students will surpass the teacher. And of course, the main thing, and the reason I bring this up, is to say that whenever I'm confronted with evidence of Jesus's actions, things that he can do that only God can do, Jesus forgives sins. In John chapter 20, he ends up giving that authority to his disciples.
Right.
Jesus walks on the water. A lot of people also forget that Peter also walks on the water, and yeah, he starts sinking because he doesn't have enough faith, but the implication there is that if he had enough faith, he'd be able to walk on the water just like Jesus did, meaning Jesus is presented as this idyllic figure with perfect faith in the Father. And if only Peter has the same faith, he could have walked on the water too. Jesus judges mankind. Well, he delegates judgment of the 12 tribes of Israel to the disciples. So as we talk about some of these examples, I want my listeners, our listeners, to recognize in my responses that is kind of my rough understanding, that in these instances where Jesus is doing something extraordinary, and yeah, he is obviously doing something amazing and something that at least common understanding would have it that only God can do, Jesus is sort of saying, no, watch, I can do this too, but only in a way that one day you will also. And the most sort of, the greatest summary of this is in John chapter 17, where Jesus is praying for his disciples and the wider Christian community. And he prays that one day, they will be in me just as I am in you, the Father, and we'll all sort of be one together, seeming to imply that the special relationship Jesus has with the Father is something that will hopefully be passed on to other people. So that's basically my broad position. Just, I thought it's worth laying that out as we go through these.
No, that's really helpful. So let me try to lay out just in a brief way mine, and then I'd like to point to some things that might be in tension with that reading, just to or
Yep.
emphasize how I basically, let me say I agree with you, because actually one of the amazing things about Christianity is that it makes very exalted claims for the gifts that it professes both the apostles, their disciples, and other believers will be able to
Yep.
share in. It's a very high claim, and this is where the whole Christian tradition of theosis or divinization comes from, even
Yes.
though that's not very well known in contemporary Christian circles and discourse, I think. So my basic position, or the couple positions that I try to lay out in this book. Number one is that on the level of the gospel narratives, I'm trying to undo what I believe to be a very erroneous position that Jesus is only divine, only depicted as divine in John and not in the
Mm-hmm.
synoptics. Okay, so I actually think that when it comes to the four sources from the first century about Jesus, he acts and speaks as if he's divine in all four: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, not just the fourth gospel. Second, I actually think that in addition to the passages that you just listed about him performing divine actions or having divine power to forgive sins or to judge, right? In addition to those, there are other passages where Jesus does things that I think he doesn't give to his disciples. So let me give you a couple of examples. Is that fair? Can we
Sure.
just do that? Okay. So
Absolutely.
for example, let's look at the walking on the sea. So I have the chapter called the Epiphanic Miracles
Yep.
in the book. This is the second chapter. And one of the main points of this chapter is actually to just demolish what I think is actually a myth. The myth that he's only divine in John and he's not really divine in the synoptics. I just think that doesn't hold up. And it's worked in the modern period primarily because in the modern period, there's been a tendency to bracket the miraculous out as if these aren't even part of the Gospels. It's almost kind of like a canon within canon. So lots of books on Jesus just ignore what are known widely as the epiphanic miracles. Now, epiphanic miracles already suggest to you that something is being unveiled or revealed, and it's not just a merely human quality, right? This is why King Antiochus IV, when he wants to claim divinity, he mints coins Antiochus Epiphanos, right? Antiochus God manifest, right? He's making a divine claim. But the epiphany miracle that I think is really crucial here in Mark 6, the walking on the sea, takes place. In it, Jesus does something, you're right, that he enables, in Matthew's version, he enables Peter at least to walk briefly on the sea before he begins to sink. But one of the things he does that at least I don't see Peter or any other disciple doing anywhere else is take the divine name as his own from the Old Testament, right? So just to give you an example, in Mark chapter 6, right, when he comes walking on the sea, and they see him, they think he's a ghost. He says to them, this is in Mark 6, verse 50, take heart, ego eimi, do not be afraid, right? So take heart, I am, do not fear, do not be afraid, right? Now, as I show in Jesus and Divine Christology, it's not just Christian apologists. It's Jewish scholars,
Yep.
non-religious scholars, Protestants, Catholics alike, recognizing that on the narrative level, at the very least, okay, the ego and me here is not just an identification. It is doing that, okay, because he's just told you they think he's a ghost. So there is a mistaken identity element taking place here, and he is saying ego and me. It is I. That's not an illegitimate translation. But that's not all that's happening, because the context is theophanic, right? It'd be one thing to just say, it's me, if you stumble across someone in the dark and you don't know who it is, and he says, I am. Okay, fine. No numinous divine implications. But he's walking on the water when he says ego and me, and he adds to it, and this is important, the standard theophanic statement, me phobeste, Greek, do not be afraid. Don't be afraid.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is what happens over and over again in the Old Testament. When a heavenly being comes down, whether it's the Lord or whether it's an angelic figure, the normal human response is fear and trembling, right? So in this case, Jesus both identifies himself, allays their fears, but then also, in my opinion, and in the opinion of lots of scholars, takes the numinous divine epithet, ego eimi, I am, or I am he who is, which is an allusion to Exodus 3, the kind of paradigmatic theophany in the Old Testament, in which God reveals his name to the Israelites it's a revelation of not just what he is, but who he is. This uncreated creator, the one who has no beginning, who has no end. He's not just the God of the mountain or the God of the river. He's the God who is. And so he takes that name as his own. That is something that I think you see not only in Mark 6, but also in John 8:58, when Jesus says, "For Abraham was ego eimi," same thing. A declaration that has no predicate, right? It doesn't say "I am God." It's just
I am.
non-predicative.
It says it at the trial as well in Mark's version.
Right. In Mark's
So
version, although
the
it's
high
not in the
priest.
others, so I didn't make too
Yeah.
much hay out of that in my
Yeah.
treatment. I was trying to focus on the triple tradition. So you're right, though. It
Uh-huh.
is in Mark too. But that's the answer to a question, right? So that's also important. Like the meaning ego and me, I am is going to have is going to be determined by context. It would be wrong for example, Christian apologists to say, whenever someone says ego eimi, they're claiming to be divine. Because the blind man says it in John chapter 9 or 10, I can't remember.
That's right. It's
Yeah,
9, yeah.
because they're asking, hey, is this the same guy or not? Right? He's different than he was, and he says, I am, which clearly means, yes, it's me. But the context in
Jesus
which
also warns his followers, like in Mark chapter 13, he says, beware that no one leave you astray. Many will come in my name and say, I am he, like ego
Absolutely.
eimi, and will lead you astray. So clearly just the usage of this name is not necessarily an invocation of divinity. Just to be
Absolutely
clear,
right. Yeah.
for our listeners here, right? So ego eimi is a Greek phrase which is
I'm
used
sorry.
in the Gospels.
Yeah.
The Gospels are written in Greek. The Old Testament is written in Hebrew. Ego eimi translates roughly as I am. You know,
Yeah,
ego is an
like the
ego. You know,
is I.
yeah. So it's I am, but it is also sort of used more colloquially to say something like it's me. So a good example is the blind man in John 9. They say, you know, is this not the man who was born blind? And he goes, ego eimi. Yeah, it's me, right? But the difficulty is that in the book of Exodus, when Moses asks God what his name is, God says, what would it be like? Asher,
Asher. Hard to translate.
I am who I am, right?
I will be who I will be. Like it is a how to put it? It's an enigmatic Hebrew phrase in itself. Like it bears multiple translations and meanings.
So it's Asher, 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 which again kind of means something like I am who I am, or I am that I am, right?
Yeah.
And then he says, so go and tell them that I am has sent you.
True.
And so he gives his name as I am.
Yeah.
Of course, the New Testament's written in a different language, but I am in Greek is ego eimi. So sometimes it does seem like when Jesus says it, especially in like John chapter 8, when he says weirdly, with a weird grammar, you know, before Abraham was, I am.
Right.
Seems like such a sort of intentional usage of that phrase that people say it's a callback, but it's complicated by the fact that it is also a phrase that people do sometimes just use to identify themselves. So here, importantly, the Gospels themselves, if you read John chapter 8:58, you know, verse 58, they translate it usually as before Abraham was, I am.
Right.
But on the walking on the water, most biblical translations, read the NIV or whatever, I'm not sure what the NRSV does, but it translates it as it's me, even though it's the same phrase, because contextually it seems like he is just identifying himself. But you're saying that in the context of walking on the water, it takes on a great deal of significance to use that identifier.
I would qualify it. I would just say, I don't think the word just is correct. Yes, he's identifying himself, but he's not just identifying himself. And the way you know that is from the context, because in this context, he's walking on the water, which if you look in Job chapter 9, for example, this is something the Hebrew scripture says only God does. Only God walks on the waves. And in fact, in the Septuagint translation of Job 9, it says that God walks on the waves as on dry land, right?
Yeah.
So this is something that Jewish scripture makes a divine attribute. And then this was really cool in the book. I'm sure you saw this part. It's also something in a Greco-Roman context was perceived as a divine power, because in the first century, when Caligula wants to manifest his divinity. This is one of the strange things about Caligula. One of the reasons a lot of the Romans thought he was crazy is because he didn't wait to divinize himself until he was dead. That's perfectly acceptable. Once you're dead, you can be divinized. But he wanted divine claims and divine attributes to be given to him while he was alive. So a lot of people said he was crazy. But in Josephus and in Suetonius, we hear Suetonius. Suetonius tells us about how in order to manifest his divinity, he builds a bridge across the Bay of Baia and then rides across it on a chariot as befitted his godhead, right? So the idea that he can cross the sea, and this is just one example, there are others as well, is both in Jewish and Greco-Roman context a divine power, a divine attribute. It's something superhuman. And so when in that context, Jesus says, ego e me, me phobesa. Don't forget the do not fear either, too. This is that language. So you brought up Exodus 3, but it's not just Exodus 3. It's Isaiah 43. When God speaks, I am God, there is no other, he reutilizes the language of I am and I am he, the same Hebrew language from the book of Exodus. But then he also says, do not fear. So Jesus isn't just alluding to Exodus 3 and the burning bush. He's also alluding to the most monotheistic passage in Isaiah about the power of the one creator God of Israel. So in that, and he does it while he's walking on the water, right?
Yeah.
So this is,
right.
this is important, right? Context matters when it comes to this. As I like to joke with my students whenever we would go through this, when we talk about this in the Gospel of John, I think I noted this. It says that they're 4 miles from the shore, because the Sea of Galilee is about 7 miles wide at the widest point. And so I would joke with the students. I said, listen, if he didn't know he was God by mile 1, he probably figured it out by mile 4, right? Like this is not just a identification of it's me. It's also a theophanic revelation. That's why it's called an epiphany miracle of the mystery of his identity, that he is claiming, he's using the name of the one God from the book of Exodus and from Isaiah. And the context shows that that's true in John 8 as well, because the response of his contemporaries is to pick up a stone and to stone him to death. And they say, we stone you for no unrighteous work because you, though a man, make yourself God. Right.
Well, he says that that's John chapter 10 when they respond that way.
I'm
right?
sorry. Did I say 8? I apologize.
Yeah, John chapter 10 you're talking about, because they pick up stones in John 8 as well, but in John 10.
So yes. So the stoning in John 8:58, John 8:59. So they took up stones to throw at him. The death by stoning is in Leviticus and in Josephus. That is that's the legally prescribed manner of execution for blasphemy. So although the word blasphemy doesn't come, the implication is that they're stoning him because he's blasphemed. And in context, blasphemy can mean a lot of different things. Like you can speak against the temple, you can speak against the priesthood. One soldier got executed by the Roman procurator Cumanus because he was ripped up copies of the Torah. So he desecrated a sacred object. And they said he also said he uttered blasphemies. So blasphemy can have a lot of different meanings, but one of them is making a divine claim. And for that, the penalty is death, not just death, but death by stoning. So again, in context, John 8 and I think Mark 6, it's really difficult for me to argue that those allusions to Isaiah 43 and Exodus 3 are just coincidental. I think they're more significant, much more significant, that they're intended to help you see that he's making a divine claim about who he is. Because remember, the name in Judaism, it reveals not just your role in salvation history, like Abraham, father of multitude. It also reveals your identity. Like, who are you? And that's something I don't see any of the apostles ever saying, ego e me, I am. In that kind of context. So I would say that's something that is actually distinctive in addition to those divine powers. Does that help?
Absolutely, yeah. And there's so much to say. It's really difficult to have this conversation actually, because especially like on YouTube, when my comment section is flooded by Christians, it's like if we spend 10 minutes talking about the Son of Man, then all the comments will say he was literally stoned for blasphemy. It's like, okay, then we'll spend half an hour talking about blasphemy, and then it's like he said I am, and then it's like, okay, well, let's talk about that, and it's like, oh, but he said that he's one with the Father. It's like we have to take these one by one, right?
Yes. And so it's really important to look at in each case what is the nature of the divinity to which he's laying claim, right? So not every passage that I looked at in the book has the same degree or kind of divine power or identity as the other. So I really tried to be clear, divine in what sense in this passage, divine in what sense in another passage. And it is a cumulative argument. It's not just that one passage kind of settles the whole thing. That's my opinion.
So looking at what you've said about the walking on the water, and of course, although I am of my opinion of, low Christology and all that.
Sure.
I'm I'm pretty. I've got no skin in this game. I don't mind. So I think it's interesting, but I'm not going to die on this hill or anything.
Can I say one quick point on that?
Yeah, of course.
So one of the things I did in the book was I tried to quote scholars who didn't have skin in the game.
Yeah.
So, for example, the famous Jesus seminar from the 1990s. That's when I was in school, and they were really hot, really popular. Most of the scholars who were members of the seminar, not all, were either atheists or agnostic. They weren't believers in the divinity of Christ or the classic Christian creeds. But when they come to the walking on the sea, they say he's alluding to Exodus 3. He's making a divine claim, and they actually say he's acting like he's Poseidon or something. I mean, so it's not just a kind of Christian apologetic that interprets the text in that way. That's a reasonable interpretation, even from a non-Christian perspective.
Yeah, I definitely think that it's a reasonable interpretation. I'd never wish to imply otherwise. But there are some reasons that give me pause for thought on this, right? I mean, crucially, firstly, right, like the main grounding for this walking on the water thing is, as you've already said, in Job chapter 9.
Yeah, right.
He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. It's like God alone treads on the waves. We're sort of speaking poetically here, and of course it is Job who is speaking. And in the very next chapter of Job, while Job is sort of shouting to the heavens, he says, "Does it please you to oppress me, to spurn the work of your hands while you smile on the plans of the wicked?" He's angry at God, and he's saying all of these things about God which are untrue. Like in the very next chapter, God is saying that God smiles on the wicked. He's saying that he pleases in oppressing him. He also says that he wished he'd never been born. Job is sort of this imperfect, theological authority at that time. Of course, that doesn't mean that we can't sort of poetically refer to Job, because people would know that phrase is in there. But I think it's worth pointing out that this idea that, we often say, like, it says in the Old Testament that only God does this, but it's important to know who's speaking and in what context. And in this context, Job is complaining and basically blaspheming himself by saying all of these things about God, which aren't true, when he's angry.
I agree, but I push back slightly. I didn't think you're right in the surrounding chapter or the next chapter. That's true. But in Job 9, 1 through 10, in those verses there, one of the things he's doing is saying, how can a man be just before God? And then he begins a poetic litany of all of his attributes as creator. And I don't get the sense from that particular context that he's calling any of those into question. I actually think he's drawing a contrast between the utter transcendence and omnipotence of the creator
and what's happening to him.
That's how I read the passage.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect reading. I just think it's or a plausible reading. I just think it's worth flagging that needs to be part of the conversation.
It's always dangerous to just say the Old Testament says
exactly. Yeah. It's like Muslims might do the same thing, where I could say, well, in the book of Job, in fact, it says God is not a man that I might question him.
Right? Everything's vanity, doesn't have any meaning. Like, okay,
and it's sort of like,
you want to
Muslims do quote that, by the way. They quote the book of Job where it says God is not a man that I might question him, and it's like, but this is Job, and he's complaining, and he doesn't. Yeah, and it's poetic, and it obviously means something else in that context.
And that's why I try to give the examples of Caligula constructing the bridge and other examples of
I think that's
walking on water,
brilliant.
Kind of show up a kind of an ancient contextual understanding of what that kind of an act by your own power would signify. That's what.
Yeah, I love that, because of course it might not be enough to have this Job reference, but if we just know that it's sort of understood at the time, then this might be the equivalent of being on like a movie set and being like, who's that guy over there? Is that an intruder? And then he's like sat on a director's chair and he goes, "Hey, everybody, you're late," or something. And it's like, he's quite clearly claiming to be the director of the movie by doing that, and you kind of need to know, if that story was read in 1,000 years from now, no one would know what the chair meant. No one would know what "you're late" as a phrase might have meant. Yeah. So it's important to know.
Absolutely. That's why throughout the book, you'll notice I quote block quotes from scriptures. I try not to just rip them out of context.
Yeah.
Because context, it's everything when you're coming to these kind of interpretations. Absolutely. Yeah.
Another point in your favor is that in the book of Job, I can't remember exactly where, but it also talks about, I think, God or the Spirit of God or something, like passing by or passing him by.
Yes.
There's this interesting phrase where it sort of says the Spirit of God or something like that, like passes him by. And interestingly, in this story of Jesus walking on the water, it says that Jesus was walking on the water past the boat so as to pass them by.
Yes.
Which is a little bit of an odd sort of thing to say, as to pass them by. It's like a bit sort of random, unless this is a second, just to make clear that we really are alluding to the book of Job here to set up the context in which Jesus is walking on the water. So, and that often goes sort of unnoticed. I think a lot of people don't bring that up, but it's interesting.
Absolutely. No. And I don't remember the Job reference, but definitely in Exodus 33 and 34, when Moses is on Mount Sinai and Elijah as well, the language of passing by is theophanic language. It's the language of the divinity coming near, but not being able to stay near for very long because human beings can't bear it. So like Moses says, show me your glory. And God says, you can't see my glory, you can't see my face, but you can see my backside. And it says, the divinity, and it says passed him by. Like you come into God's presence, but it's a temporary experience of divine power and divine presence. So yes,
I think
Joel Marcus
Job
in his commentary on Mark mentions that as well, that at the level of narrative, Mark's deliberately taking that language of passing by as a theophanic illusion.
I think
so
it's
there's like one
chapter
theophanic illusion,
4.
2, 3, 4, it adds up. I'm sorry.
Exactly. I don't know if this is the phrase that would be used, or the this is the one that they point to, but in Job chapter 4, verse 15 or verse 14, fear came upon me and trembling, which made all my bones shake, which is, sort of, as you say, classic evidence of theophany. And it says, then a spirit passed before my face, the hair of my flesh stood up. And so there's this sort of interesting language. So but again, like you say, this is all a little bit sort of skirting around the edges, but the Bible, the Gospels are sort of intentionally mysterious. The only thing I would point out here as well is that this passing by business, that's not Jesus speaking. This is
no. That's why I didn't address it as much in the book, because
it's important to separate those questions, right? There are three questions here that I always like to separate out. One is whether Jesus was God. The other is, did the historical Jesus claim to be God? And the third is, do the Gospels portray Jesus as claiming to be God? And those are three different questions. Right?
And my book
in fact, one other question is do the Gospel authors themselves portray Jesus to be God? Right?
Sure. And so my book's on number 2. Did Jesus claim, and did the Gospel authors proclaim is secondary, but it's there. And I actually think the fact that Mark uses that theophanic illusion of passing by is evidence that at least the earliest interpretation we possess of this episode is reading it as a theophanic manifestation of his superhuman identity, where he's making a divine claim. That's how I take it. So
the only other thing that I want to bring up here is, and I can't remember which scholar it was that brought this to my attention. It's someone who co-wrote, it's that book. It's like Mark's Christology 4 Views or something.
I know the one you're talking about. Yeah,
but I can't remember who it was in that text. But they brought this to my attention that, of course, like we've already mentioned, let's talk about this ego eimi business. I am. It shows up all throughout the Gospels. And something really important to note is that the Gospels are written in Greek. The Old Testament or Hebrew Bible is written mostly in Hebrew, a little bit in Aramaic, right? And this Hebrew phrase, Eesha, Asher, Eesha, I am that I am, and then go and tell them that Eesha, I am, has sent you, repeating that word 3 times. When the Gospel authors are writing, they're writing in Greek, and we have good evidence to suggest that the authors of the Gospels were using a Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, right?
Well,
so they're reading a Greek version, some kind of Greek version of the Hebrew Scripture. And so the interesting thing about the Septuagint is that if you look at Exodus chapter 3 in the Septuagint, it's translated into Greek. And what does it say? When Moses says, what shall I tell them your name is?
Tell them Ho'on has sent you.
Yeah, he says, ego eimi ho'on, which means something like, I am the one who is. In that context, saying ego eimi ho'on is like saying, I am the one who is. So I am there, the ego eimi, is just an introduction to the label, and the label is ho'on. So he says, ego eimi ho'on, so go and tell them that ho'on has sent you. So if a Greek-speaking, a Greek-writing author of the New Testament reads this Old Testament passage, ego eimi ho'on, so go and tell them that ho'on has sent you, and wants to put the divine name into Jesus' mouth, they're not going to write ego eimi, they're going to write ho'on. So writing ego eimi can't be an allusion to the divine name in Exodus, because that isn't the Greek name of God in the Septuagint.
Well, it's not. Okay, yes. Okay, good argument. Very nice rejoinder. Doesn't quite land for 2 reasons. Number one, the Septuagint, This is so complicated. Okay, I don't want to make this more complicated.
Okay.
It's not just Exodus 3 that matters. Let me put it this way. It's
Right.
Isaiah 43 as well. So in the Septuagint of Isaiah, which many scholars see as an allusion to Exodus 3, it is ego eimi. That's the translation. So in other words, there are different ways to translate that Hebrew expression. And just because the edition of the Septuagint that we have, which by the way, that's super complex to know whether the version of the translation of Exodus 3 that we have in what we call the Septuagint today is the same Greek translation of Exodus that the gospel authors was using, is something we can posit as reasonable, but not demonstrate. Okay. Especially when it comes to the Hebrew name, because even your English Bibles will tell you, wait, the NRSV does it this way, and the RSV does it that way, and the NIV does it that way, because that Hebrew expression lends itself to multiple translations. So we got to be very careful here just to say they wouldn't have said ego eimi, because ego eimi is not in the Septuagint of Exodus 3 that we have, because it is in the Septuagint of Isaiah 43. And so it is actually a viable translation of that expression from the Hebrew. So I feel the force of that, but I don't think it actually clinches it, especially when, again, the context here is not just a quotation from the Greek Septuagint, but it is more than Exodus 3. It's Isaiah 43 with the "don't fear, I am" as well. And it is rendered as ego eimi there in Isaiah. Does that make sense? Does it help a little?
Oh yeah, it does.
Okay. That's a that's a good point. The scholar who pointed out is excellent. We're not saying that it has to be word for word, but ego eimi ha'on enough, even just the deleted version ego eimi is still close enough to that Exodus 3 allusion to Exodus 3 story of the burning bush to posit an allusion to the name of the God of Israel, especially when Isaiah, the Septuagint of Isaiah, uses ego eimi as the divine name in its monotheistic hymn in chapter 4.
I'd find it so much easier to just accept this line of reasoning if it weren't for the complication that ego eimi is also just a commonplace phrase for "it's me." That just makes it so difficult to know with confidence what's going on here.
Sure, I understand, but and that's why you have to determine each one on a context, case-by-case basis, right? So, for example, in Luke 24, when Jesus wants to identify himself on the road to Emmaus, he doesn't just say ego eimi. He says ego eimi autos. It is I. It puts an emphasis on there. So it's not like everyone's walking around saying I am all the time. There are a few examples of it. We don't want to deny those, but the meaning has to be determined by the context, especially when it's a passage that has a scriptural allusion. Okay. I think that's when there's reason to say more's going on here than just the denotation of the words.
Yeah. And also, I think it is worth pointing out as well in your favor that I could, I think confidently, for basically every single claim you put forward, well, he says I am, well, he walks not, I could say, yeah, but that could be this, or yeah, but that's this. Yeah. But it does get a bit suspicious when you put them all together. So yeah, okay, maybe he's just sort of saying it's me. Maybe he just is walking on the water as a miracle, and that just happens to line up with what Job says only God can. But when you have all of this stuff happening together, it starts to sort of paint this impressionist picture.
Especially the reaction of the disciples. So you used Matthew earlier when we were talking about the paralytic. What about Matthew on the walking on the sea?
Okay, yeah, fair enough. They worship
because
him.
What they happen is they proskuneo, they get down on their knees and say, surely this is the Son of God. Now, again, not every context is kneeling necessary a sign of divine worship. But there are contexts when it certainly is. Again, Alexander the Great, one of the points I made in the book that I hope people take away from it is that Jesus isn't the only historical figure during the Second Temple period to make divine claims about himself. Sometimes Christians, because we put so much emphasis on the uniqueness of Jesus, we can tend to forget that there are aspects of making divine claim that are not actually unique, right? So I tried to give 4 examples. Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC makes divine claims. Antiochus in the 2nd century makes divine claims. No one talks about this. It's shocking to me. King Herod Agrippa in the 1st century in the New Testament in Acts and Josephus makes divine acts as if he's a god. The crowds say the voice of a god, not a man. I mean, this is like a part of the Herodian dynasty. He's a practitioner of Judaism acting as if he's divine. That's a historical analog. And then, of course, Caligula I mentioned earlier, is a Roman emperor. So one of the things I tried to show is there are these other people making divine claims. You don't have to believe Alexander or Antiochus or any of these people is divine to ask the historical question, did they speak and act as if they were divine in their context? And when it comes to Alexander, one of the cool, interesting things about him is that there was a controversy because he was demanding proskunesis, kneeling in worship, while he was still alive. And although the Easterners were happy to give it to him, the Greeks said, the Macedonians like, no, we don't do that. Like, we're not going to bow before you as if you were divine. And so there was this controversy about it. And so when Jesus says, I am, and then the disciples fall down on their knees, again, at least at the narrative level, that is a powerful argument that Matthew thinks Jesus here is making a divine claim, and that the disciples recognize it and give him homage in a way that they would not have done to an ordinary human being. Because when John, the Revelator, as they call him sometimes, when the author of Revelation, when he bows before the angel in the book of Revelation, he gets down on his knees and the angel's like, whoa,
get up.
Don't get up, don't do that, right? So again, context matters here. And so I do think that's another kind of cumulative argument for the Walking on the Sea episode. Although I hope we haven't talked about it too much.
No. All right. Look, we're doing worship. Let's do worship. This is one of my favorites. I love this so much because you've already alluded to the fact that, again, it's important to notice that it's not just proskuneo. It's proskuneo in the context of an I am claim whilst walking on the water. That's important. Yeah. But let's talk about worship, because another thing that people like to bring up all the time is that, Jesus accepts worship. It's not just that people worship him, but that Jesus doesn't contradict him, right?
Yeah.
And it seems like worship is something that only God is due. And so if the disciples will worship Jesus and he said, no, get up, don't worship me, then great. But he accepts it on a number of occasions. I've got a lot to say on this. The first important thing is that, this word worship, proskuneo, or comes in different forms, which just literally means to kneel down, to sort of bow down in front of. Now, I am of the opinion that basically this is just something that people do when they recognize that someone is of a higher authority or status than they are. For example, if we look at the Septuagint, right? If we look at the Greek version of the Old Testament, this term proskuneo shows up a lot. Lot worships two angels in Genesis. Abraham worships the Hittites. Isaac blesses Jacob and says that all of the nations on earth will worship him. Jacob worships Esau. Joseph's brothers, Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, his brothers come back, and when he's the governor of Egypt, they worship him. They proskuneo. It just means that they're bowing down before him. The entire nation of Israel bows down before some of the kings of Israel. David at one point even worships the temple. So clearly, if worship is something that's only due to God, all of these people are sinning, right? This term proskuneo can just mean to bow down. I think that the explanation that we can give for why it is that sometimes people say, don't worship me. The same thing happens at Peter in Acts.
Yes, absolutely.
Someone bows down before him and he says, get up because I'm just a man like you.
Man, yeah, right.
Exactly. And that says to me, he's not saying, one reading of that is when Peter says, get up because I'm just a man. One reading of that is he's saying, get up because I'm not God.
Right.
But another reading is to say, get up, I'm a man just like you. I'm on your level. I'm not a higher authority than you are. But if it were someone of a higher authority, it would make sense to proskuneo before them. Similarly, John of Patmos is bowing down before the angel, and the angel in that context is saying, look, I'm a messenger of God, you're a messenger of God, we're both below this figure. Get up, don't worship me, worship God, because we're both of this level that we should only be worshiping God above us. So, okay. Few things to note here. If this worship point is important, and for a lot of people it is important, Jesus accepts worship. One thing that I think is important to point out is that you only really get this in Matthew's gospel, right?
Yeah,
Mark,
no, actually,
Luke,
I should be
and John
clear.
seem to not care about worship, and Jesus doesn't really get worshipped at all in those gospels. It's only really in Matthew that this shows up, right? You wanted to say something.
Oh, I just wanted to say, just to be clear, I'm tracking everything you're saying, and this is one of the reasons why I actually didn't make this a foundational argument in this monograph.
Yeah.
Because I actually do think it can't bear the weight that's sometimes given to it. So go ahead. I just want to be clear that the proskunesis controversy is not something that I spend a lot of time with, because I don't think it's actually a strong argument. Yeah.
And it's worth pointing out as well that there is this other term for cultic divine worship.
Latreo,
latreo or latruo.
Latruo,
And this phrase shows up more uncommonly, and when it does show up, it's given to God. There's nowhere in the New Testament that latruo worship is given to Jesus. Some people think it's in Revelation. That gets a bit more complicated, but certainly in the Gospels, latruo worship isn't given to Jesus. So when the disciples are beginning to realize that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is the Son of God. He's the promised one. He's the anointed one. For them to realize this after some, miracle working, they worship him, they proskuneo before him and say, truly, this man is the Son of God. It's as if, the king comes back on his chariot with his crown and they all bow down and say, truly, this man is the king. He is the Son of God, as sometimes, kings were called. It's not an unintelligible reading to me to say that, they bowed down in front of him because they realized his authority as the promised Messiah.
I totally agree. In fact, I would argue that proskuneo in Greek has almost precisely the same range as worship in modern, but also Middle English. And it's worthy of honor. And you can give it to a king or you can give it to God. And the context is everything, right? So, in British English, which is different than American English, obviously, like your worship is not implying that the person you're speaking to is divine, but of some status of authority. So, I actually agree with you, Alex, on that.
Yeah.
That I do think you don't want to make more out of proskunesis than possible.
Yeah.
At the same time, it is interesting that in the lives of Alexander, that particular gesture of worship in certain contexts, in the Macedonian and Greek context, was actually seen as problematic, that Alexander would demand it. Now, but that was the only analogy I was trying to make with the walking on the sea.
There is also something interesting about, I'm glad you bring up Alexander the Great, because there's a legend told in Josephus's Antiquities.
Oh, yeah.
He tells this legend of Alexander the Great, who goes to conquer Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And he wants to conquer Jerusalem, and the crisis is averted how? A priest meets him outside of the walls of the city, and his mitre bears the tetragrammaton. It says, has the divine name Yahweh on this mitre. And what does Alexander the Great do when he sees this priest bearing the name of God? He proskuneos before him. He bows down before him. So you've got Alexander the Great worshipping a man because he's literally got a sign that has the name of God in it. And I think that if Jesus is in some sense carrying the name of God, he's just a human, but he's given this authority by God, and he's sort of a name bearer for Yahweh. It's exactly the same thing happening when Alexander bows down before the priest bearing the divine name. The disciples bow down before Jesus, who has, God in him.
Yeah, I would agree with everything except the just. I agree.
Yeah, right.
Affirming, but not what you're denying in that there, because I think he's that, but he's much more. And I can give other examples of why I think that's the case. But that's a cool story. That's a fantastic. It is definitely, it shows that when it comes to the expression of veneration, the expression of acknowledgement of divinity around power through veneration is a very complex phenomena. It has to be examined on a case-by-case basis. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Totally.
I have to thank my friend John Nelson for that story. He's got
that's a really cool story. That's a real
behindthegospels.com. He writes for it. I recommend it on my Substack. He's a good friend of mine, and he's a wonderful writer and talks, and he's got an essay on Jesus accepting worship and all of this kind of stuff. And I went pretty deep on this. I mean, the only other thing that I think people might have in their minds, which is worth bringing up, is the fact that in Matthew and Luke, you have the temptation in the desert, right? Like Jesus is in the desert and the devil comes to him and says, do all of these things. And Jesus says no. On one of these occasions, Satan asks Jesus to bow down before him. He says, just worship me and then all of this will be yours. And Jesus says in response, it is written, how does he word it? Worship God and serve him alone.
Yeah, you should worship and serve him alone. Exactly.
Yeah. It is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. And so people often point to that and say, especially given that Matthew does have Jesus constantly worshipped throughout the Gospels, if Matthew has this story where Jesus says, worship the Lord your God and serve him only, that means that only worship is given to God. Importantly, though, if the reading of this is that proskuneo is only given to God, then all of those Old Testament figures are massive sinners. And also it's worth pointing out that the phrasing is not only worship God, it's worship God and serve him only. And what's the word serve?
Latruo. Yeah,
the kind of worship that's only given to God. There is one case I think you can make for latruo worship being given to Jesus in the Gospels. And that is the fact that when Jesus claims to be the Son of Man, who comes riding on the clouds of heaven, he's quoting the book of Daniel, and in the Septuagint for Daniel, the Son of Man is said to be given latruo worship. So there is this possible allusion to latruo worship being given to Jesus, but I think that's it.
It's elusive, but it's not explicit in the gospel text. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I actually think the Daniel 7 passage is super crucial. Although, can I take your point and like segue to
course.
something? So,
Please.
yes to everything you said about worship, but if we could talk about love for a second, I'd actually like to talk about love because there's a relationship here. In chapter 3 of the book, I have a chapter called The Riddles of Jesus' Divinity. And one of the passages in there that really blew me away when I was looking through the gospel text was Jesus's demand that his disciples love him more than father and mother. So he says in Matthew 10, for example, if anyone loves father or mother more than me, they're not worthy of me. All right. This is a passage that is extremely evocative. It might not strike us as all that powerful, but I would argue in a first century Jewish context, this is really a powerfully, although implicit, but a powerfully elusive claim for divine status. Because when I began to dig into it, one of the things you'll see in Philo and Josephus and other Jewish writers is that in exegesis of the Decalogue and the fourth commandment, honor your father and mother, right? Which in Hebrew is actually glorify them. It's kavod. It's the same word for glory, like give glory to your parents. In first century Jewish texts like Philo and Josephus, they say that the only person above your parents is God, that your father and mother stand second to God alone because they gave you life. And it's almost like a kind of co-creative act. So there's a quotation here. Let's see. I found this. So in Philo, he says, quote, that your parents are on the borderline between humanity and divinity, right? And Josephus also says, quote, the law ranks parents as second only to God in honor.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So this is fascinating. It's a really interesting point. And you'll see this in other texts. Those are just a couple of examples. So there's this idea that you have the gravest of obligations to honor your parents above anyone else, with the sole exception of the Creator. And so then Jesus steps onto the scene in this Jewish context where honoring your father and mother is, part and parcel of the Decalogue. It's something you recite daily. It's also, Philo and Josephus are really good examples of witnesses to
the Decalogue, by the way, is the Ten Commandments.
Oh, I'm sorry. The Decalogue means, yes, 10 words, 10 commandments written with the finger of God, Exodus chapter 20, right? So this is the 10 commandments. Fourth commandment, or at least in the Catholic enumeration, I know other people count it differently, is honor your father and mother. And so Philo and Josephus say that that what this means, if you draw it out, is they're second only to God, because the first 3 commandments are about loving God, right? No other gods before him, so against idolatry, keeping the Sabbath, keeping it holy, and not taking his name in vain. The second half of the commandments are about loving your neighbor. And the first one is give glory, chavod, to your father and your mother. So they are literally at the top of the list, right, when it comes to the 2 commandments. And that first set of commandments, the first 3 commandments, God says, whoever keeps these, I will bless those who love me and keep my commandments. Okay. So obedience in the Decalogue is actually an expression of love. So in a Jewish context, when Jesus comes and says, anyone who loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me, that is such a shocking saying. It's hard for us to really wrap our minds around, especially in modernity, when we don't have all that much respect for our parents. Culture, at least in Western culture, like the idea for respect for parents has really fallen away. And the idea that it would be some kind of grave sin to not exercise it is almost kind of completely foreign to our mindset. So what I try to show in the book is that Jacob Neusner, for example, very famous rabbi from the 20th century, wrote a book called A Rabbi Encounters Jesus. When he gets to this passage from Matthew 10 in the Gospels, he says, listen, whatever people might debate about the Jesus of history, the Christ of faith, he says in this passage, when Jesus says, you can't be my disciple unless you love me more than your mother and father, he says, only God can ask of me what Jesus is asking here. So even as a contemporary practitioner of Judaism, a contemporary rabbi, he recognizes that the implication of Jesus demanding super parental love is an implication that he is more, not just more than any merely human, but he takes a role above that of your parents. And that's really fascinating to me because it explains something really interesting about the early church. We don't just have evidence of the early church worshiping Jesus, right? We also have evidence in Ephesians and Peter of loving Jesus. This is really unique. I mean, you can maybe inform me. I'm not an expert on ancient Greco-Roman religion. I just dabble as much as I can. But as I looked around, saw all kinds of evidence of you have to honor the gods, you have to serve the gods, you have to obey them, you have to offer sacrifice. But I didn't find language of loving God in the same way that you find in the Jewish scriptures, the Shema, which is basically every day you recite this commandment to love God, and then the Decalogue, which is an expression of loving God through obedience. So when Jesus comes on the scene and says, unless you love me more than father and mother, you can't be my disciple. Any Jew would have asked, whoa, like, what are you asking me? Like, who are you claiming to be if you say I owe you a super parental love? And at least according to Rabbi Neusner and some others, exegetes, that this is another case where Jesus is demanding divine love. He's demanding something of his disciples that in a Jewish context you would only give to the God of the Shema in Deuteronomy 6. So anyway, just another example. So the argument from worship, I think, is more complicated, but the argument from divine love and superparental love is really forceful, in my opinion.
Now this that's really difficult for me. The reason is because this is a passage that, this passage and this concept which I haven't really dove into, and I can tell you what my immediate thoughts are, but it's going to be pretty uninformed. The first thing that springs to mind, of course, is that there are different kinds of love in the New Testament. Famously, you have agape, which is your sort of unconditional love, the kind of love that God has for humanity. You've also got like eros, which is romantic or sexual love. You also have this particular term used for like familial love, like between parents and children, which is something like storge or something like that.
It's kind of affection,
and then
familial affection.
And then you have phileo, I guess is how you'd pronounce it, which is another kind of love. I don't know how you'd exactly
love of a
define
friend. It's kind of that. It's
So I just, as you were speaking, I just looked at Matthew 10 in Greek, and the kind of love that's used there is this philo, the same root word that you get in philosophy, love of.
Sure.
And the question that would spring to mind to me is, of course, it's written in Hebrew, but the kind of love that God demands for himself, I wonder if that is this philo love, or if this is more like this unconditional agape love. Because maybe you could say that, like, well, when he says that you have to love your parents, he's talking about that familial love. But when Jesus says you have to love me, he's talking about a different kind of love. He's talking about philo, which is like the love of friendship. So you still love your parents the most in a familial sense, but you love me more as like a friendly acquaintance, someone you listen to, someone you confide in, that kind of thing. And again, this is purely speculative. I have no idea, but that would be where I would start researching to see, is there room to still interpret this as Jesus saying, in this context, this extraordinary claim that, you have to prefer me over your parents, but not in all kinds of love, just in the kind of love that's relevant to, following him as the Messiah. You know what I mean?
I understand. And I would say, my response would be fair point. Although the scholarship on this there's an enormous amount of scholarship, and
I bet.
If you look at like commentaries on John 20, where Jesus will use phileo and agape almost as synonyms, it's actually kind of difficult. I know C.S. Lewis wrote that famous book, The Four Loves, where he separates these into pretty tight categories that they're separate from another. It's actually a little more complex on the ground, and phileo and agapao can actually be used synonymously. They are used arguably as synonyms in the Gospels themselves. So for me, again, it's less about the denotation of the word and more about the context. Whether it's phileo or agapao, it is super parental. And that's actually the part that I was trying to make, to say that it's more than mother and father, at least according to Josephus and Philo. That's something you really only give to God. And it's an extraordinary demand on Jesus' part. And you'll see it elsewhere, like when someone says, I got to go bury my father. And he said, let the dead bury their dead. Come and follow me. So he makes these extraordinary demands. And if he's alluding to the Decalogue and the Shema, then again, it's a kind of elusive, implicit demand that is truly extraordinary. And as Rabbi Neusner says, it really seems that he's asking something that only God can demand of you, to put him above his parents. Anyway, that was just another passage. While we were talking about worship and love, I thought I'd throw that.
Yeah. That's cool. Okay, so one thing that we have to talk about, we've been talking for a while now, and I think before we end this podcast, it would be ridiculous to not mention. We sort of alluded to the Son of Man a bunch throughout this podcast, And we've mentioned that it comes up at this trial of Jesus. And of course, the most important thing about Jesus' life is something we haven't even mentioned yet, which is the fact that he dies under Roman crucifixion and allegedly raises from the dead. And the story of exactly why it is that Jesus is put to death, the story of why Jesus had so upset the Jewish authorities, they convict him of blasphemy, he's doing something. This is like really important Christologically, to the extent that anybody who hasn't watched up to now, anyone who doesn't watch the rest of the podcast, is probably already commenting in the box down below. Of course he's God. That's literally why they killed him. So, blasphemy claim, trial, what's going on here?
Okay, great. So the final chapter in the book deals with both those questions. The issue of Jesus's crucifixion, actually three: crucifixion, the blasphemy charge, and the title Son of Man. So let me see if I can kind of wrap this up in a bow and bring it to the climax. Because you're right, this is the most consequential element. So if you look at historical Jesus scholarship, it is almost universally recognized that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified by Pontius Pilate. Like, this is something as accepted as a historical fact. So there's no argument about whether he was crucified. But when you actually press into it and ask, well, why was he crucified? What's the reason for the crucifixion? Then it actually gets more complicated. It's fascinating that there's lots of disagreement about the causes or the reasons that led to the crucifixion. Some people say, oh, well, he was a false prophet, or he was executed for being a deceiver, he was executed for being against the law, or he was executed for being against the temple, or he was executed because he made a claim to be the Messiah. And most of those charges, although they're reasonable kind of in the abstract, if you look at the sources, there's not a lot of evidence to support those things, with the sole exception of messianic claim. Obviously, the messianic claim plays a part in his Roman execution because it's there on the title of the cross, Jesus of Nazareth,
King of the Jews.
But the problem with even with that one is that it isn't a crime in Judaism to claim to be the Messiah if by Messiah you simply mean the heir to the Davidic throne, right? If it were a crime to claim to be the Messiah, then how would you ever know who the Davidic heir was, right? You know, I'm the heir of David's throne. Kill him. That doesn't make sense. It's not plausible within a Jewish context. So the question also has to be not only why did the Romans execute him, but why is he handed over for execution by the Jewish authorities to the Romans? And so that actually pushes the point that Anthony Harvey made a long time ago in his book on Jesus and the Constraints of History, that the only charge that we have that all four Gospels agree on as a cause for his execution is the accusation of blasphemy.
Blasphemy.
Right? This is really, really important. So if you look, for example, at Mark chapter 14, although, for example, Jesus's the so-called cleansing of the temple where he turns over the tables, that's certainly a factor in his arrest, but he is not charged with any kind of capital crime for what he does in the temple. Most people will argue that's the reason for his execution, but not only was it not a capital crime, the Gospels themselves don't even tell us that was the reason. If you look at the Gospels, the reason he is sentenced to death, the reason he is handed over to the Roman authorities is the charge of blasphemy. Now, the reason that matters is because in a first century Jewish context, as I said, it isn't blasphemy simply to claim to be the Messiah. But it would be blasphemy to claim to be a divine figure, to be more than just the Messiah. And I think that's exactly what happens in Mark chapter 14 in the famous scene before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. So the passage is familiar, but I'll read it just to be precise. When Caiaphas says to him, "Are you the Christ?" Messiah, Mashiach in Hebrew, Christos in Greek, the Son of the Blessed, Jesus says in Mark, "I am," so it gives an affirmative. There it's just an answer to the question, I think. And, see, this is the point, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Now, pause. In that answer, Jesus does not simply say, "I'm the Davidic heir." He adds to it an allusion to Daniel 7, which depicts the one like a son of man coming on the clouds of heaven, right? And receiving the latria that you talked about earlier, the worship. In other words, he's a heavenly being who appears to be human and then is given the kingdom and the power and the glory and all that. And Jesus alludes to Psalm 110, which says, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool." So it's, again, a kind of royal psalm that's depicting a heavenly enthronement of the Davidic heir. So what Jesus says is, "I'm the Messiah, but I'm not just any Messiah. I'm the Messiah, the heavenly being of Daniel 7, who comes on the clouds and receives worship and all that. And I'm the super Davidic Messiah of Psalm 110 who sits on the throne beside God, which in an ancient Near Eastern context, if you sit on a divine throne, it implies equality with the divine regent, with the divine king. So by making that answer, Jesus doesn't just affirm his messiahship, he goes beyond and implicitly claims to be a heavenly Messiah, like in Daniel 7, and a co-equal or divine authority, like in Psalm 110. And in reaction to that, the high priest says he tears his mantle, which is a reaction to blasphemy, by the way, in the Old Testament. It's a kind of visible way of showing shock and horror. And he says, why do we still need witnesses? You've heard his blasphemy. What is your decision? And they all condemned him as deserving death, right? So the gospel narrative there makes it really clear that Jesus is accused of blasphemy in the context of a question about his identity. Who are you? Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed? And he answers it by alluding to those scriptures. So what I think is important about this passage is that it shows, at least the level of the gospel narrative, that the reason Jesus is handed over to the authorities is not because he's a false prophet, not because he's a deceiver, not because he made a mess in the temple, or because he was against the law. It's because he made a divine claim about himself, or a claim about himself that goes beyond what they think would be acceptable for a merely human Messiah. He claims to be a heavenly Messiah, a divine Messiah. And that kind of claim would be blasphemy and would be guilt, would merit death. So I think that the blasphemy charge, which is not just in Mark, it's also in Matthew and also in John as well. John, think here, John 19, we have a law, and by that law, he deserves to die. It's an allusion to the book of Leviticus, the capital crime of blasphemy. If you put that all together, I think the most plausible explanation for why Jesus is handed over to crucifixion is because he makes a divine claim in the context of the Sanhedrin that they perceive as blasphemous, and that's what ultimately leads to his crucifixion. So from my point of view, as Sanders said, the smoke of the early divine Christology really originates in the fire of Jesus' divine claim that we see leads to his death. And that's why I think the divine Jesus is actually the most crucifiable Jesus in terms of historical plausibility than all these other scenarios in which he's not making divine claims and yet somehow still ends up handed over by the authorities for a capital crime.
I don't doubt that is the most crucifiable version of Jesus. And of course, this is the big climax, but there are a number of questions which jump out of this for me. And it's a strong case, and people make it all the time. They sort of quite confidently say, well, look, Jesus is clearly, when he says, you will see the Son of Man sat at the right hand of power, coming with the clouds of heaven. These are allusions to the divine Messiah. And it's like instantly the high priest recognizes that these are allusions to Daniel and to Psalm and says, this man is blaspheming. And that must be because he's claiming to be God. A few things that I want to point out. Firstly, this is not the only time when Jesus is accused of blasphemy for claiming to be God. Right, this also happens in John chapter 10, where Jesus says, I and the Father are one. We don't have time to get into that at the moment. Sure. I talked about it in my debate with David Wood. I have a whole interpretation as to why I really don't think he's claiming to be God by doing that. Could be, but I don't think it's obvious. But the important thing to note is that when the Jewish opponents pick up stones to stone him, and he says, why are you doing this? For which of these good works are you stoning me? He says, we're stoning you for blasphemy, because you, a mere man, are claiming to be God. And in my interpretation of the story, Jesus then goes on to basically say, you've misunderstood me. Maybe that is what he meant, but it at least leaves room for just the idea that, yeah, these people instantly said, you're blaspheming, claiming to be God, but maybe they were wrong, because Jesus is speaking quite cryptically here when he says, he makes these allusions that seem to maybe be implying this or implying that, and the priest hears it and goes, you've heard the blasphemy, like we need to stone this man. There's no obvious indication. It's not obvious to me that Jesus couldn't, if he wanted to, say like, no, you're still not quite getting it, but he sort of goes along with it as part of God's plan. I just want to point out that a lot of the time when Jesus is accused of blasphemy, they're getting it wrong, right? And that might be what's happening here. So then, what about this allusion to Daniel, this Son of Man who's given la truer worship and all of this power? The question that jumps out to me and what I want to ask you is like, this is part of the Hebrew scripture, right? Before Jesus came along, Caiaphas would have been aware that there is this Danielic Son of Man, and that there is this psalm which is a messianic psalm, which is God sort of talking about the promised Messiah, who everyone knew was coming. And Jews believed that these figures were coming, right? And so if Jesus claims to be that person, and Caiaphas instantly goes, "Oh, he's claiming to be God," did Caiaphas already interpret this Danielic Son of Man and the Messiah promised in the Psalms as God? You see what I'm saying? Like, in order for him to think that Jesus identifying with these figures, he's claiming to be God, he would have already had to think, before Jesus came along, that these figures in the Hebrew scripture, which he believes in, describe a coming promised human figure who is also God, which seems kind of out of line with Jewish teaching. So it seems a little bit weird to me that, there's a really, obviously Jesus is alluding to Daniel here, but to say that therefore he's claiming to be this divine figure would imply that Caiaphas would know that the Son of Man was going to be like God himself in the flesh, which seems like implausible to me. You know what I mean?
There's a great objection. I really well put. I totally get where you're coming. So I'll respond if you got a second. I'll try to sum it up. Obviously, it's so.
Yeah. Of course.
Okay. This is a great point. So I would answer it in this way. First, it actually isn't in tension with common Jewish teaching, because if you look at apocalyptic Jewish texts from the 1st century AD, I'm thinking here of texts like 4th Ezra, texts like 1st Enoch, like the similitudes of Enoch, which is from the 1st century, as well as Dead Sea Scrolls, like 11Q Melchizedek. The idea that of a superhuman Messiah is something that actually is present in apocalyptic Jewish texts and interpretations especially interpretations of Daniel. 4th Ezra and 1st Enoch are both interpreting the Danielic figure in Daniel 7, not just as the Messiah, but as a pre-existent heavenly being who's been hidden from all time and is now being revealed. Now, just because those Jews believe in that kind of super exalted divine Messiah, like whoever the authors of the 1st Enoch literature were, think here maybe of the Essenes and the figures the authors of the Dead Sea Scroll Library. It doesn't mean that every Jew accepts that as an orthodox interpretation of those texts. Does that make sense? And the debate over those very cryptic and enigmatic texts is going to continue well into the rabbinic Jewish period. So Alan Siegel, a late Jewish scholar, wrote a famous book called The Two Powers in Heaven, where he talked about the fact that in even the later rabbinic texts, there's this notion that if anyone interprets Daniel 7 as a second power in heaven, that's a blasphemous exegesis of that text, right? So these are not univocally interpreted passages in 1st century Judaism, but they don't have to be. In fact, the fact that they might be controversial questions actually lends credence to the idea or controversial texts, that if Jesus cites them and then seems to interpret them as being a divine messianic figure, it doesn't have to be like fully incarnate in the way we understand through Nicene. He only has to be making a superhuman or a divine power claim for it to be sufficient for blasphemy, right? I mean, Antiochus isn't claiming to be God made man. He's still blaspheming when he says he can walk on the sea or whatnot. So the fact that Jesus interprets those texts in a potentially controversial but not implausible and not unprecedented way is totally sufficient grounds, especially if the Sanhedrin is looking for a reason to execute this figure that they've had problems with and has caused them trouble in the past. So that's how I would read that, and that's how I would respond to that. Yes, Caiaphas I think you can make a plausible case that he would be aware of that kind of exalted apocalyptic interpretation of the Daniel figure or of Psalm 110, because we have evidence in the scrolls, we have evidence in the Jewish pseudepigrapha that those interpretations were in the air in the 1st century AD. So that'd be my response.
I mean, this came up in my debate that I had with David Wood. I mean, his case was rely quite heavily on this two powers in heaven idea, and for me the question sort of comes down to the evidence for pointing to the idea that this was sort of floating around. I mean, we don't have
that's later. I don't want to hang anything on it. I'm just using an example of its
it seems to sort of
plausibility. You can take that
all have evidence of that,
and just look at their 1st century sources.
Coming up later. This is an annoying part in the Q&A actually, where someone, because I made a case where I basically said that there is no pre-Christian text that discusses the two power in heaven heresy, and somebody got up and I was a little bit confused exactly what they were saying. I can't remember, but they referred to some passage from the Talmud where they're talking about it, and I was well, when was this? And he says it was a few hundred years BC or whatever, and I was sort of like, and I was like, wait, hold on, and I was thinking to myself, but I'm sure that like there's no prior source, but this guy's just telling me that there is. So I was sort of a bit like, maybe I've just like missed something. Something afterwards, I spoke to him. I said to him, like, come and speak to me. I found out that the text was written much later, but alleged to refer to something further back. So
no.
This two powers in heaven thing seems to be maybe something that develops in response to Christianity.
Absolutely. Alan Siegel's work, this is a rabbinic debate. I was just alluding to that to show that the debate continues. Well, BS. Just take that off the table. You don't need anything from the Talmud. The Second Temple sources alone on Daniel 7, similitudes of Enoch, 4th Ezra, which is late 1st century, and then 11 Q Melchizedek, which is a Dead Sea Scroll, again, 1st century BC or CE, on Psalm 110. You have early Jewish sources from the Second Temple period already interpreting Psalm 110 and Daniel 7 in superhuman categories. And that's all you really need for a plausible interpretation of the way Jesus uses the passage here. I would not hang anything on the two powers heresy, except to show you that those texts continue to be controversial in later Jewish tradition, especially in contradistinction to Christian appropriations of the book of Daniel and interpretations of Daniel. Yeah,
sure.
So you're right. I agree with you on that point. Yeah.
Parking the two powers thing, I'm going to throw out just a couple of responses here to this blasphemy stuff, and then I promise that we can wrap this up and put it to bed, as it were. So on this blasphemy point, because it is important, right? There are
very
things I want to say. Firstly, you referred to John chapter 19, where the Jews answer, we have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has claimed to be the Son of God. In this instance, they make a difference. They do at some point say, you're claiming to be God. In this instance, they just say, he's claiming to be the Son of God. Yeah. And we have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he claimed to be the Son of God, implying that it seems like people can put a man to death just for claiming to be the Son of God, rather than claiming to be identical to the God Yahweh of Israel. A few other instances that point to me, like, you can point to biblical injunctions about laws about what punishments go for what things, and there's a discussion to be had about to what extent those were actually enforced. But certainly we know that people were killed for blasphemy. The thing is, the kinds of blasphemy that they were killed for vary all over the place. I mean, an important example for me is, of course, in the book of Acts, in chapter 7, we have the death of Stephen. And Stephen is accused of blasphemy, and it's like throughout the whole of Acts chapter 6, you're hearing the story of Stephen going about and doing stuff, and it's written in Acts chapter 6 that people sort of conspire to like lie about Stephen in order to get him put to death. What do they say about Stephen? Well, Acts chapter 6 verses 11 onwards say, they secretly instigated some men to say, we have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God.
Yes.
And then it says, they stirred up the people as well as the elders and the scribes. Then all of a sudden they confronted him, seized him, and brought him before the council. They set up false witnesses who said, this man never stopped saying things against the holy place and the law, for we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and will change the customs that Moses handed on to us. So they say that they're accusing him of blasphemy. And what is he doing that's blasphemous? Well, he's saying that Jesus will destroy the temple and saying that he will change the customs that Moses has handed on to us. If simply like changing the customs of Moses is enough to get you an accusation of blasphemy, then it's no surprise to me that Jesus gets killed. And in his actual death, Stephen has a vision similar to Jesus, right? Jesus is before the council and he looks up to the sky and he says, I see the heavens have opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. And they started covering their ears, and then they all rushed at him and they stone him to death. What do they stone him for? For blasphemy. What does he actually do that gets him stoned? He simply sees a vision of Jesus stood actually this time at the right hand, or is it sat this time? I get them mixed up. Standing at the right hand of God. And so it's enough to just think that Jesus is the Son of Man figure to get blasphemy, to get the accusation of blasphemy and stoned to death, let alone claiming to be that Son of Man, and let alone claiming that that Son of Man is also God himself. So it seems to me that the Jews were a little bit trigger happy, in other words, when it came to accusations of blasphemy, meaning I don't think Jesus would have had to make this explicit claim to be God in order to get that stoning.
Okay, that's fascinating you read it that way, because I actually read the same data differently. So let me just back up. Yeah. Maybe I'm wrong here, but unless I'm mistaken, and I think I'm not, I don't think the word blasphemy is used for any of the allegations they make against him, like speaking against the law, speaking against the temple. Those are all problematic, but I don't think they're identified with the term blasphemy. Perhaps I'm wrong.
In
but,
Acts chapter 6, it shows up. All it says is it says that they instigated some men to say, "We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God." That's Acts 6:11, and then it goes on to talk about the things that he did. Right, so it doesn't then say that they stoned him for blasphemy or anything. It just says that previously they accused him of blasphemy, crucially against Moses and against God.
I got it.
And then later he's stoned as a result of all of that.
All right, I'm tracking now with you. Okay, so I understand. Yeah, so this is one of the things that come in the book. There are lots of different ways you can speak. You can commit sacrileges in the temple, speak words. Even if you put a curse on a priest, like if you cursed a priest, that would be considered blasphemy. So yes, you don't have to make a divine claim to be charged with blasphemy. Absolutely, that's not what I'm claiming. Although I read it differently, because the thing that actually gets him killed is when he makes a claim about Jesus. So it's not just that he sees it. It says, but Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, gazed in heaven, saw the glory of God, Jesus standing at the right hand of God, and then said, "Behold, I see the heavens open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." And so they cried out with a loud voice and they stopped their ears. So I think this is the one that's very clearly blasphemous. Is his declaration that the Son of Man is, Daniel 7, is standing at the right hand of God, Psalm 110. That's the blasphemous claim that leads them to drag him out of the city and stone him, both of which are prerequisites for those are both what Leviticus 24 says you do to a blasphemer. You take him out of the camp and then you stone him to death. So my reading is actually that Stephen is executed not for blasphemy in the same sense that Jesus is, because he's not making a claim about himself, but he is executed for the same claim of that's blasphemous, because he's making it about Jesus. He's making it about the Son of Man. The other things are bad. They can be regarded as blasphemous, as it although that's kind of summary statement at the beginning. So I want to go back and try to tease out what that is. But this is what gets him killed. His allusion to same two passages, Psalm 110, Daniel 7, but making it verbally the claim about Christ or Jesus as Son of Man. And so I actually think that actually is an argument of coherence with my reading of the trial, because just as the Sanhedrin sees the allusion to those two texts being applied to Jesus as a divine self-claim, so too Stephen's allusion to those two texts, Daniel 7 and 110, Psalm 110, as being about the risen or exalted Jesus. That's seen also as a blasphemous claim about him, and it's worthy of capital punishment, because he's claiming a man has these divine qualities. So I read it differently. I actually see it as confirmatory rather than conflicting evidence. So that's my read.
Yeah, well, that is just sort of, that's just the way with these things, isn't it? You know, the same verses of the same text being used to justify different conclusions. Yeah. I think at the very least it's
all simple, but it isn't.
Yeah. That's for sure. That's the one thing that should be clear in all of this, and it's also one of the reasons
I would add to it though one last thing. It is clear though, all of the early Christian executions in Jerusalem that are reported in Acts or in Josephus or in Josephus' early fathers, whether it's Stephen or James, the brother of Jesus, in Josephus, or the early Christian Jerusalems who are executed by the Sanhedrin. Nobody ever talks about this, but it's in Josephus. All of them are stonings. And that's important. Stoning is the legally prescribed punishment for blasphemy against the deity, right? So not all crimes are capital crimes, but making divine claims about human beings is one of them. So I think that actually, again, puts a kind of cumulative argument that helps us to understand that Jesus isn't making a merely human messianic claim, but rather a divine one. I think that's the one that makes the best sense of the most evidence.
Yeah, there's obviously so much to say, because you're right. People point to other reasons why Jesus might have been killed, like, you know, in Deuteronomy it says that any prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name that I have not commanded the prophet to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. So basically, false prophets shall be killed.
Deuteronomy 13. And if that passage were quoted in the trial, I'd say that's the reason.
Then fantastic, but it's not, and it's the stoning, and I don't actually know what the punishment is for false prophets, if it's also stoning, or if it's not specified, or if it's something else.
Well, there's some different there's different evidence about that. I don't remember off the top of my head. I do remember though that the false prophet one, that passage from Deuteronomy is interesting because it actually gets picked up in the Tosefta which is an early rabbinic tradition, collection of rabbinic traditions, and says really clear that certain crimes, like capital crimes, you punish those people during the festivals, like Passover, Tabernacle, so that everyone will see and fear and obey. So sometimes people say, Jesus, the count of the trial isn't plausible because it's during Passover. And in the book, I tried to show, actually, at least as far as the rabbinic tradition goes to, it's the opposite. Those punishments are reserved for festivals because then everyone's going to be there and they're all going to see, and they're going to make sure they don't repeat that kind of grave crime. So
that's interesting, yeah, because that's a question I didn't get to ask, was like the plausibility of the historicity of all of these Jewish authorities getting together on the most like holy night of the year to convict some random Jewish rebel.
It's not only plausible, but the Tosefta says it's mandatory for capital crimes to be executed. Also, too, it also says, for what it's worth, again, it's later, so you have to be cautious with it. And it says that you have to have 2 hearings. Well, they do, and that they have a night hearing, and then there's a brief morning hearing, and then off he goes to the crucifixion. So it's remarkable case of coherence, at least with law on capital crimes, right?
Yeah.
Minor crimes, they should be carried out at the festivals. The rabbis say that. But the Tosefta actually is clear on capital crimes for false prophets and anyone who idolaters, people lead people astray. So,
well,
anyway,
that's
all
great.
Right. So
it's awesome.
My upshot is, I think the crucifiable Jesus, the Jesus, the one who's accused of blasphemy, makes sense of early divine Christology. I think it makes sense of how early high Christology is there because he makes a high Christology claim during his life. I think it explains its explanatory power for the separation of the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity. Why do we start seeing splits between these communities? It's because making a divine claim about the founder is going to be something that's going to be a dividing line between Jews and Christians. It's also why we see stonings for Paul. Why does he get stoned in synagogues? Maybe he's making or what are taken as blasphemous claims, right? And then I think it also just provides a really plausible explanation for the divinity of Jesus being such a central topic of the rest of the New Testament text, as well as obviously the patristic theological debates that'll eventually culminate in the Council of Nicaea. But that's a long way down the road. So we're just focused here on this. So I hope that's helpful.
I'm going to make one request of our listeners, which is to first point out that, of course, we haven't covered everything. Even in the Synoptic Gospels, there's all kinds of stuff we haven't talked about. Jesus being Lord of the Sabbath, Jesus judging mankind, all this kind of stuff. But also, we, of course, haven't talked about the Gospel of John, which, as you say, famously is thought of as the high Christology Gospel.
Sure.
I think it's got a really interesting Christology. We've kind of intentionally not talked about that because the Synoptics is like a more important focus here, given that so many people think they've got a low Christology. So my only request to our listeners is that if you've got interesting things to say, you want to talk about Jesus as the Son of Man and healing the paralyzed man and stuff, let us know in the comments, that kind of stuff. But please, just try to refrain from going into the comments and saying, John 10:30, the Father and I are one. Just like, I know a lot of people do this. They comment things like that as if I'm going to read that comment and go like, oh my, how did I miss that? I've done all this research and all this. I've got to go read John chapter 10. I didn't realize that he said, like, I know he said that. I've got things to say about it. We have intentionally not spoken about it here, and we'll perhaps do so another time.
I have another conversation about John.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, I need to do the John Christology thing in podcast form, I think, because it's just way better than a debate as well. I enjoyed the debate. I thought it was fun and all that kind of stuff, but this is just better. It's a better way to be. So I really appreciate it. And when I was preparing for that debate, I read your book and I found it really, really useful and interesting. And it's Jesus and Divine Christology. A link is, of course, in the description for people who are interested. Maybe we'll revisit this at some point in the future. But for now, thank you so much for your time. It's been a great one. I really, really love this topic.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks a lot.